The odd story began in 2016. Joanna told her siblings that their mother, Maria Evelyn Sayos, had abruptly traveled to Singapore. According to her, their mother had left in emotional distress, needing time to rest and reflect. The last time the 54-year-old Maria Evelyn Sayos was seen was August 20, 2016. After that day, she simply vanished. The disappearance left her family confused and uneasy. Joanna reassured them that Evelyn stayed in touch through social media messages, sending birthday greetings and short updates. As time passed, doubts only deepened. The messages from Evelyn were short, strangely impersonal. She never initiated video calls, never posted new photos. When asked about her life in Singapore, she gave vague answers. How could a woman with no serious family conflict suddenly cut all communication? The warning signs multiplied. Her passport was missing, and immigration records showed no departure from the country. The more the family investigated, the more inconsistencies they found in Joanna's story. Months became years. Eventually, on September 7, 2018, 2 years after Evelyn disappeared, her son, John Michael, reported her missing. At first, police were not alarmed. Adults often leave voluntarily. They believed there was no urgency, and the case remained low priority. Everything changed in June 2020, when renovation work was being done at Evelyn's house. One afternoon, Michael noticed a strong, foul odor coming from beneath the kitchen area. At first, he dismissed it, but the smell grew worse. Finally, he asked workers to dig. Beneath the concrete layer, they found Evelyn's ID card, passport, and bank card, hidden inside the flooring. Fear replaced hope. Michael no longer believed his mother was in Singapore. Yet he was terrified to dig any deeper. The next morning, he called the police. Officers arrived and were ready to investigate. Workers continued excavating. Hours later, they reached the top of the unfinished septic tank. When the cover was removed, a thick wave of stench filled the room. Inside lay a body, badly decomposed, almost unrecognizable. The area was immediately sealed off, and paramedics were called to recover the remains. The discovery stunned Michael and investigators. The body was transferred to the regional forensic laboratory. The autopsy results were devastating. The body belongs to Maria Evelyn Sayos. The examination confirmed homicide. Her body bore multiple stab injuries. Her skull had been fractured by a heavy object. There were 5 stab wounds to the chest, 2 to the neck, and defensive cuts on her right forearm. It was clear the killer acted with rage, likely hatred. Michael's worst fears were no longer speculation. His mother had been murdered, but he needed answers. Who had done it? And why? The case that had puzzled the family for 4 years finally made sense. The woman everyone believed was living in Singapore was actually long dead, buried under her kitchen floor. Suspicion immediately focused on the 2 people who had insisted Evelyn was abroad: Joanna and her boyfriend, Ronald James Ruby. On July 23, 2020, police arrested Joanna and Ronald on suspicion of murder. During interrogation, investigators questioned them about Evelyn's disappearance. Both had lived in the house throughout the time she supposedly went to Singapore. Now their behavior was tense, nervous. Silence filled the room until Joanna broke down. She confessed in tears. She had killed her own mother, and Ruby had helped her. The motive behind the killing was rooted in long-standing conflict. According to investigators, Ruby resented Evelyn deeply. He and Joanna were often criticized for their lifestyle. Evelyn, a strict, outspoken mother, frequently clashed with her daughter about responsibilities at home and how she was raising her child. The constant fighting created a toxic atmosphere. According to the suspects, anger and frustration grew until it exploded into violence. Evelyn, known as a caring mother from Dasmariñas, Cavite, devoted her life to her 2 children. Like many Filipino mothers, She combined affection with discipline. She wanted her children to succeed, especially her daughter. When Joanna became pregnant at 16 and moved in with her boyfriend, Evelyn felt heartbroken that her daughter was throwing away her education and future. According to Evelyn's son, she often scolded Joanna for neglecting her responsibilities as a young mother. She meant well, but her tough love only made Joanna more resentful. Whenever Evelyn scolded her, Joanna would run to Ruby and complain bitterly. Over time, Ruby became angry as well. He likely saw Evelyn as a barrier, a constant source of conflict. Eventually, the resentment hardened into a sinister plan. On the day Evelyn disappeared, Joanna called her mother downstairs, telling her she had a surprise. Unsuspecting, Evelyn walked down. At the bottom of the stairs, Ruby was waiting with a hammer in his hand, consumed by rage. He struck her on her head. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, groaning in pain. There was blood everywhere. But she was still alive. Panicked, and realizing the situation had gone too far, Ruby shouted for Joanna to bring a kitchen knife. Joanna obeyed. Together, they inflicted multiple stab wounds, determined to make sure Evelyn would not survive. When the attack was over, they carried Evelyn's body to the unfinished septic tank beneath the house. They threw her into the murky water and believed they had erased their crime. Ruby then added gravel, sand, cement, mixed it himself, and sealed the tank. They were convinced no one would ever find out, but decomposition has a smell that cannot be silenced. As days turned into weeks, the odor of the body grew stronger. Neighbors noticed the stench coming from the house. Ruby was frequently seen mixing more cement, trying to seal cracks. Each time the smell returned, he would add another layer of concrete, desperate to hide what lay beneath. Meanwhile, Joanna created a second deception. She took control of Evelyn's online identity, posing as her mother on social media. She posted birthday greetings, replied to relatives, maintained the illusion that Evelyn was alive and well in Singapore. For years, this trick worked. Friends, family saw the posts and believed nothing was wrong. No one questioned Evelyn's absence, until Michael discovered the documents buried under the floor. From that moment, the lies began to crumble. The truth finally emerged. Ruby was charged under Article 248, while Joanna was charged with murder under Article 246, a crime marked by extraordinary cruelty. At the moment, no public information is available regarding the final verdict for Joanna Marie Sayos and Ronald James Ruby concerning the murder of Maria Evelyn Sayos. According to the latest reports, both were arrested, formally charged, and remain in custody. It appears the trial either has not been concluded or has not been covered by the media. After the Sayos case shook the Philippines, another disturbing story from a different country illustrates how evil can hide behind ordinary walls. This case unfolded in Bogota, Colombia, made headlines in 1998. Local newspapers and television broadcasts reported that authorities had arrested a witch. The so-called witch turned out to be a con artist, a woman who claimed to practice magical arts, promising healing, prosperity, and protection. In reality, her spells, potions, rituals existed for one purpose only: to deceive people and steal their money. Her real name was Maria Concepcion Ladino. She was better known as Doña Conchita or La Hermana Maria. Born in the 1962 in Bogota, she is said to have been fascinated with black magic and occult practices from a young age. One morning, while waiting for a food truck, Maria got into a fight with another woman. Both had fiery tempers, and the argument quickly turned physical. Realizing she was losing, Maria suddenly stepped back, waved her arms strangely, began muttering incomprehensible words. Bystanders could not understand what she was saying, but the scene was unsettling. Within days, rumors spread through the neighborhood. When her rival was hospitalized shortly afterward with severe bone pain, neighbors whispered that Maria had cursed her. Maria was soon branded a witch. Surprisingly, Maria did not fear the title. She embraced it. If anything, she saw an opportunity. People now believed she possessed real powers. Soon they began seeking her help. Very little was known about Maria's personal life. She rarely spoke about herself. Neighbors only knew she had no husband, no children, no family. She rented a room in a large house owned by an elderly couple, Eduardo, a retired man, and his wife Nubia. Eduardo spent most of his time in front of the house, solving crossword puzzles. Nubia could usually be found near the local school, selling papas corrientes, a popular Colombian dish. Maria quickly earned their trust. Seeing them struggling with their daily chores, she offered to help, shopping, cleaning the house. She promising to heal their aches and pains with a secret aromatherapy oil and herbal massage. The couple was grateful. Slowly, Maria became indispensable to them. Then, one day, the elderly couple simply disappeared. At first, no one was alarmed. Life in the neighborhood went on. A few people noticed that Nubia had stopped selling her food. When neighbors asked Maria where Eduardo and Nubia had gone, she said they were sick, or that they had moved to live with their children. No one questioned her further. Maria's appearance had improved significantly. She dressed better, looked well-groomed, and seemed much healthier. A few months after the elderly couple disappeared, their children from Ibagué visited because they hadn't heard from their parents in a while. They found the house locked and Maria absent. Concerned, they contacted the police, who forced the door open. Inside, everything appeared normal. A missing person report was filed. The investigation revealed that a large amount of cash, about 15 million Colombian pesos, was missing from Eduardo's home. Months later, children playing near the San Juan River discovered a body beneath a pile of stones. It was Eduardo. His corpse showed multiple injuries, indicating a violent death. Despite an investigation, the perpetrator could not be identified. Nubia, his wife, was never found. On August 15, 1994, Maria quietly moved to Fontibón, a lively suburb west of Bogotá. Once again, she began searching for a room to rent. She eventually found lodging in the home of 54-year-old Carlos Montaña, who lived with his wife and 3 small children. Immediately, Maria began using the same strategy she had used before. She told Carlos he looked exhausted and offered her healing skills, claiming she had remedies given by forces from the other side. She produced a mysterious substance from her bag. Carlos took it, more out of politeness than belief. Over the next weeks, Carlos began trusting Maria. He took the potions she provided, and he truly felt better. Soon he was doing everything she instructed. He bathed in herbal mixtures to drive out evil spirits, took part in ritual sessions, obeyed her spiritual advice. To the family, they began believing Maria truly possessed some gift. But in October of that same year, everything changed. Carlos's wife returned from work, noticed he hadn't eaten the food she had prepared. She went to the bedroom and found her husband asleep. Moments later, Maria entered, told her not to wake him. He was in a spiritual trance. She led Carlos's wife and children downstairs for a séance to guide his soul. During this séance, the wife felt a chill run down her spine. Anxiety rising, she hurried back upstairs. There, she found Carlos lying in a pool of blood. She noticed a deep wound at his throat. Horrified, she called an ambulance and the police. Police arrived within minutes and questioned Maria and the widow, but neither provided clear answers. Investigators soon learned that Carlos had been poisoned. Then his throat had been cut. In the following days, the widow received handwritten letters, supposedly written by Carlos from beyond the grave. The letters urged the family to trust Maria. claiming only she could help him find peace in the afterlife, that all belongings should be given to her. This time, the widow did not believe the trick. She threatened to report Maria to the police. The next morning, Maria disappeared. She resurfaced in San Cristobal, where she rented another room. Soon she met Adalberto Guevara, a taxi owner with 2 vehicles. He confided that he was struggling financially and believed he was cursed. Maria confirmed his fears and offered to cleanse him from evil spirits. For 1 million pesos, she subjected Adalberto to several herbal baths, just as she had with others before him, but her ritual was only beginning. After several weeks, Adalberto realized that the cleansing rituals had done nothing to improve his situation. In fact, his finances were getting worse. Desperate, he decided to sell his taxis and placed an advertisement. Maria learned of this quickly. She told him she had a son who would gladly buy the vehicles, and advised him to withdraw the advertisement. Shortly afterward, a purchase agreement was signed. Maria paid using a check. She then convinced Adalberto to undergo one final cleansing ceremony, promising that it would protect him from all evil, no matter what happened. After that, Adalberto was never seen alive again. When his family went to the bank to cash the check, they were told it came from a stolen checkbook and was invalid. Alarmed, the family began searching for Maria, certain she was responsible. A week later, they received letters from beyond the grave, written in Adalberto's name. They contacted the police. Maria was arrested and charged with fraud, but she was eventually released due to lack of evidence. After her release, she returned the cars and moved away. This time, she settled in Bucaramanga, where she became known as Sister Maria. In August 1996, she resumed her activities. Her next victim was an elderly woman named Heidi Ferrero, a jewelry seller. Maria used her familiar method, convincing Heidi that her business needed a blessing ritual to prosper. The ritual took place in Heidi's shop. Maria spoke in a made-up language and handed her a glass containing a green liquid. Moments later, Heidi collapsed. Maria searched the store, stealing jewelry. Before leaving, she took Heidi's car keys, placed the unconscious woman in the vehicle, drove several kilometers to a secluded area, poured gasoline she had purchased earlier, and set the car on fire. Heidi's body was discovered the next day. Maria had already vanished. Maria returned to Bogota and befriended a woman who kept 3 million pesos hidden at home. Maria manipulated the woman, offering her the magic potion. This time, it only rendered the victim unconscious for a few hours. While she slept, Maria took the money and left, believing the woman was dead. In 1997, Maria settled in the San Cristobal district, north of Bogota, where she once again managed to steal a large sum from an elderly couple before murdering them. Until then, she defrauded more than 20 people. Some victims disappeared entirely, while others, terrified of her supposed powers, preferred not to report her to the authorities. In early April 1997, the 3 sisters of Belo Clavio approached Maria for help. Their mother was in the final stage of cancer. The grieving daughters hoped Maria might somehow save her. Maria agreed. She visited their home multiple times, performing her bogus rituals. In the process, she learned that the dying woman had saved 13 million British pounds, which would go to her daughters upon her death. The mother died a month later. Maria claimed she had done everything possible, and then comforted the grieving daughters. A week later, when they received their inheritance, Maria convinced them that the money needed to be blessed. She promised that through a special ritual, the inheritance could even be doubled within 4 months. In the following months, the sisters received the now familiar letters from beyond, supposedly written by their mother, urging them to trust Maria completely, because Maria would protect them. In mid-July 1997, Maria met the 3 sisters to begin the ritual. She instructed them to bring the money and place it in a wooden chest. which was then slid under the bed. Once done, Maria began to summon spirits to cleanse it of negative energy. The sisters held hands. Maria acted as a medium, allowing them to speak with their deceased mother through her. After some time, the sisters attended another seance to communicate with their mother, but during the ritual, one of them began to sense that something was wrong. She quietly went to the room where the chest was kept. When she opened it, she was shocked to discover that it contained only 4 banknotes. When her 3 sisters found out, a heated argument broke out. Maria tried to calm them, insisting that the money was still there, only invisible to ordinary eyes. She assured them that if they remained patient and trusted her, they would receive double the amount they had placed in the chest. As the final step, Maria said, the sisters needed to undergo a purification ritual. The ritual, she explained, had to take place by water. So Maria led the 3 sisters to a stream outside the city. There, she handed them a potion and instructed them to drink. They obeyed without question. Moments later, one after another, they collapsed into unconsciousness. Maria then lifted several heavy stones, hit them on the heads. She covered their bodies with branches and stones, then walked away from the creek. 5 days later, the 3 sisters' relatives reported the disappearance of them to the police. During the investigation, authorities discovered that a woman named Maria had recently been involved with them. Within days, they located the address of the room she had rented. But when the police entered, she was already gone. Veteran investigators were convinced this was not her first crime. They began reviewing unsolved cases from the past. Soon found an unsolved case from 1994 involving so-called witchcraft and healing rituals. More cases followed, all linked by rumors of a wandering witch targeting vulnerable victims. Police began searching for a woman between 40 and 45 years old, believed to be involved in occult practices and constantly moving from place to place. On August 10, 1998, the bodies of 3 women were discovered near a creek in Bogotá. They were badly decomposed, but within hours they were identified as the missing sisters. Autopsies revealed traces of benzodiazepines in their systems, the same substance found in several earlier cases. At the scene, a detective noticed a surveillance camera positioned near the creek entrance. He requested the footage from the day of the disappearance. The video revealed the license plate of the vehicle carrying Maria. On August 17, 1998, police organized an operation to locate and arrest Maria Concepcion Ladino, the prime suspect in a string of disappearances, murders, and frauds. The next morning, around 1:00 a.m., on August 17, officers spotted her traveling in a taxi. A pursuit began. When the taxi stopped, Maria jumped out and tried to run, but she was quickly captured. She claimed she had no idea why she was being arrested. During interrogation, she laughed, insulted officers. She behaved erratically, apparently attempting to feign madness. Investigators, however, saw through her performance. They were now certain they had arrested a calculating, cold manipulator. Maria was transferred to El Buen Pastor Women's Prison in Bogotá and underwent psychiatric evaluation. After several tests, she was found fully responsible for her actions and diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. In 1999, Maria Concepcion Ladino was tried. She was convicted of killing 6 people, including 3 sisters, and defrauding more than 20 people. She sentenced to 40 years and several months in prison. After serving more than 2 decades in El Buen Pastor Prison in Bogotá, Maria Concepcion Ladino was granted conditional release in 2019. Thanks to her age, declining health, the good grades she accumulated during her sentence, which reduced her sentence from 40 years to about 30 years in reality, according to Colombian law. Since then, she has lived in seclusion on the outskirts of Bogotá, away from public and media attention, with her exact whereabouts not publicly disclosed due to victim protection and personal security measures. As of 2025, There is no new information about her activities, but investigators are still keeping a close watch to prevent any recurrence, while the local community still refers to La Hermana Maria as a warning about the scammers lurking in the shadows. In the late 1970s, Cuba was experiencing a period of severe socio-economic hardship. Daily life was marked by shortages, restrictions, and uncertainty. It was during this challenging period of history that Maritza and Emilio met. They immediately felt a mutual attraction. Emilio fell deeply in love with Maritza, believing she was the one he had been searching for. However, his family worried about their relationship. They were both very young and their future together seemed unstable. Like many young couples, their strong feelings for each other led them to move quickly. Without thinking things through carefully, their daughter, Joandra Núñez, was born on May 29, 1977. Afterward, motherhood became Maritza's main focus. She dedicated herself completely to their daughter. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming in the marriage. By 1978, barely a year after the wedding, Maritza began confiding in her parents about serious problems in her relationship. The household was tense, arguments were frequent, and the situation deteriorated further after Joandra's birth. Emilio loved his daughter deeply, but his idea of fatherhood was rigid, controlling. He distrusted Maritza's ability to raise their child and became increasingly possessive. Maritza, in turn, grew alarmed by his jealousy, aggressive behavior. Emilio, however, blamed their struggles not on himself, but on the oppressive political, social, and economic environment in Cuba. Eventually, Emilio began talking about escaping the country. He confided in a friend he trusted. That trust was misplaced. The friend reported him to the authorities. Emilio was arrested and classified as a political prisoner. He faced a sentence of up to 20 years in a Cuban prison for attempting to flee the country, despite everything. Maritza and Emilio did not immediately separate. There were still feelings between them. But prison walls created an insurmountable distance. Emilio was cut off from his wife and from his daughter's life. During his incarceration, he was subjected to psychiatric treatment, including electroshock therapy, procedures he later described as degrading, traumatic. By 1980, Joandra was nearly 3 years old, and Cuba was on the brink of massive change. That year marked the beginning of the Mariel boat lift, a mass exodus in which more than 125,000 Cubans fled to the United States, most heading to Florida. For many, it represented escape, survival, and the promise of a new life. Maritza was among those who left. She managed to reach Miami, but was forced to leave Joandra behind in Cuba, under the care of her grandmother. Determined to reunite her family, Maritza worked tirelessly, saving money and navigating the complex immigration system, hoping one day to bring her daughter and mother to the United States legally. For nearly 9 years, Maritza rebuilt her life in America. In 1989, she remarried. Her new husband, Armando Martin, provided stability and support. Together, they had a son. The marriage also made it possible for Maritza to finally bring her loved ones, most importantly, Joandra, to the United States. For the first time in years, mother and daughter were reunited. Life seemed to be moving in a hopeful direction. That same year marked a turning point for Emilio as well. As part of broader political changes, he was released, granted the opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. He dreamed of starting his life over. But by then, Maritza had built a new life, and Emilio struggled to re-establish contact with her or with Joandra. Before leaving Cuba, Emilio remarried, began rebuilding his life. Eventually, he traveled to the United States with his new wife and her son. Ironically, shortly after arriving in Miami, Emilio coincidentally met Maritza and Joandra. Joandra, now around 10 years old, did not recognize him. To her, he was a stranger. Emilio longed to embrace his daughter, but the child was visibly frightened. For Emilio, that moment was devastating. A painful reminder of all that he had lost and could never get back. Emilio had no choice but to keep moving forward, adapting to life in a new country, while clinging to the hope that one day he could repair his relationship with his daughter. He and his newlywed wife moved into a mobile home on a farm, where Emilio worked as a caretaker and property manager to make a living. The family struggled financially and barely made ends meet. But Emilio refused to return to Cuba under any circumstances. Despite the cramped living conditions, Emilio always kept a separate room prepared for his daughter, just in case she ever chose to live with him. He often admitted that Joandra occupied a special, irreplaceable place in his heart. He thought about her constantly, replaying memories and wondering how her life was unfolding without him. Emilio longed to reconnect with his child, but Maritza firmly opposed the idea of her daughter having a close relationship with her biological father. At that time, Joandra lived with her mother and stepfather in the Miami area, near North Lauderdale. By the time she completed elementary school, Joandra was considered one of the brightest students in her class. She was cheerful, sociable, quick-witted, and academically gifted. However, everything began to change once Joandra entered her teenage years. After transferring to Oakland Park Middle School, her behavior shifted noticeably. Her grades declined. She began skipping classes, and she grew increasingly withdrawn. When friends asked what was wrong, she hinted that things at home had become difficult. At first, her family attributed the changes to the stress of adjusting to a new school. But over time, the situation worsened. There were no reports of conflicts with classmates, yet Joandra seemed emotionally distant. At the age of 15, she began dating a boy named Angel. In November 1992, Joandra discovered she was pregnant. Terrified and unsure what to do, she eventually told her mother. Maritza's reaction was harsh. Rumors later circulated that Maritza had physically struck her daughter. Some people believe she used a belt to punish Joandra. These allegations were never officially confirmed, and no domestic violence reports were filed. Joandra herself never spoke publicly about abuse. Still, her friends believed that tension and poor communication at home were at the root of her emotional decline. Joandra reassured those closest to her that everything would soon return to normal. On the evening of Wednesday, November 25, 1992, Joandra unexpectedly offered to wash her parents' car, an unusual gesture that stood out. However, with Thanksgiving approaching the next morning, her family didn't give it much thought. Maritza and her husband assumed Joandra was simply trying to be helpful or make peace. The following morning, the household stirred awake, except for Joandra. She remained in her bedroom long after everyone else was up. After several hours passed, her continued silence became alarming. Maritza and her husband went to check on her. When they entered the room, they found Joandra lying on her back in bed, her eyes open, completely unresponsive. Panic set in instantly. Maritza called emergency services, but when paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. Joandra was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation determined that Joandra had died from a gunshot wound to the chest. She had used a .25 caliber pistol that belonged to her mother. The firearm was typically kept in the trunk of Maritza's car for self-defense. Investigators soon realized the significance of Joandra's offer to wash the car the night before. It had been a way to access the weapon. Initially, detectives examined the possibility of foul play involving family members. However, forensic evidence ruled that out. Gunshot residue was found on Joandra's hands, and her fingerprints were present on the weapon. A suicide note was also recovered. The medical examiner concluded that Joandra Núñez had taken her own life. Although Maritza and her husband remained under scrutiny for a short period due to standard investigative procedures, no evidence supported claims of violence or coercion. Ultimately, both were cleared. and the case was officially closed. Joandra's death devastated her family. The loss was incomprehensible. 3 days after Joandra's death, Emilio received a phone call from a friend. It was only then, barely an hour before the funeral, that he learned of his daughter's tragic fate. The news sent him into a state of uncontrollable rage. He immediately accused Joandra's mother and stepfather of deliberately hiding her death from him, robbing him of the chance to say goodbye. Emilio abandoned everything and rushed to the funeral. But instead of grieving quietly, he began aggressively questioning everyone in attendance. He was convinced that Maritza had played a direct role in pushing their daughter toward end her life. His anger intensified when he learned that Joandra had been 13 weeks pregnant, that her mother had allegedly scolded her repeatedly instead of offering comfort or support. Even during the funeral itself, Emilio openly threatened his ex-wife and her family. His behavior was considered alarming. Still, most people attributed his outbursts to overwhelming grief and emotional collapse. Law enforcement officers were present at the service, and Emilio approached them, hoping to uncover what he believed was the real cause of his daughter's death. When officers refused to share details or confirm his suspicions, Emilio became convinced that authorities were conspiring with Maritza to cover up the truth. In his mind, Joandra would never have taken her own life willingly. He was certain she had been driven to it, or worse, murdered. From that point forward, Emilio began stalking Maritza. He confronted her in grocery stores and public places, accusing her repeatedly of killing their daughter. His version of events grew increasingly erratic. At one point, he suggested that Joandra's stepfather might have been the father of her unborn child, implying abuse. Emilio ignored the fact that Joandra had left a suicide note identifying her boyfriend as the father. Emilio became convinced that Maritza had psychologically destroyed Joandra and manipulated her into ending her life. He criticized the official investigation, calling it superficial and prejudiced. He accused the detectives of not caring about immigrant families. Those close to Maritza believed the accusations were baseless. She was devastated by her daughter's death, sank into profound grief. Eventually, she sold the family home, unable to bear the pain of walking past Joandra's bedroom. Even after moving, Maritza would sometimes return to the neighborhood, sitting in her car near the house for long stretches, staring silently and crying. Her own way of coping with unbearable loss. Another reason for the move was Emilio's escalating harassment. His relentless threats, visible rage made Maritza and her husband fear for their young son's safety. They ultimately relocated to another part of Florida to stay with relatives. Maritza sought help from police and requested a restraining order against Emilio. Instead of granting it, officers discouraged her, warning that such an order might only provoke him further. Effectively, her request was denied. Nearly 2 months after Joandra's death, Emilio still could not locate Maritza and refused to let go of his obsession. Convinced that the person responsible for his daughter's death was walking free, he decided to seek public attention. In January 1993, he contacted a local news station, shared his version of events, accusing Joandra's mother and stepfather of driving her to end her life. His story caught the attention of journalist Ingrid Cruz, who saw a compelling human interest angle. She and a cameraman agreed to visit Emilio's mobile home on January 18th. Once the camera was rolling, Emilio recounted his story with intense emotion, vivid detail. His pain appeared raw, and the journalists found themselves moved by his anguish. After the interview, Ingrid and the cameraman suggested filming Emilio at Joandra's grave as a closing scene. Emilio agreed without hesitation, before heading to the cemetery. However, the journalists also decided to speak with Joandra's boyfriend. He agreed to be interviewed and shared information that added new layers to the story. He revealed that Joandra had, at times, spoken about wanting to end her life. He also believed that Maritza's harsh treatment had deeply affected her emotional state, He recalled Joandra expressing a desire to leave her mother's home and return to live with her father. Words that, in hindsight, took on a haunting significance. After the interview with Joandra's boyfriend ended, Ingrid and the cameraman headed to the cemetery, where Emilio was already present with his wife and child. He visited his daughter's grave every single day, leaving fresh flowers and remaining there quietly for about half an hour. But this visit would unfold very differently. As filming began, a car slowly passed by. By sheer coincidence, Maritza had also come to the cemetery that day to pay her respects to their daughter. While Emilio stood near the grave, Ingrid and the cameraman approached Maritza's vehicle. Ingrid knocked on the window and began asking questions. After placing flowers at the grave, Emilio noticed what was happening and rushed toward the car, shouting angrily at Maritza. Ingrid attempted to calm him, hoping to preserve the interview and de-escalate the situation. But emotions quickly spiraled out of control. Maritza did not respond. She remained silent and stayed in the car. Emilio suddenly turned away, walked back to his car, began searching for something inside. Moments later, Maritza stepped out of her vehicle, walked toward her daughter's grave. Ingrid followed her, continuing to ask questions. Emilio trailed behind them, shouting accusations, calling Maritza a traitor, blaming her for their daughter's death, and hurling insults. Maritza did not answer. She remained silent as she approached the grave. Suddenly, Emilio pulled out a handgun, shot Maritza in the back of the head. The shooting occurred directly in front of the journalists, and the entire act was captured on camera. Even after Maritza collapsed to the ground, Emilio's rage did not subside. He continued firing. In total, he discharged 12 rounds, 10 of which struck Maritza in the head, neck, chest, and back. When later asked why he had done it, Emilio showed no remorse. He calmly stated that killing Maritza might have saved his daughter's life. He then returned to his car and fled the scene. Ingrid was left in shock, frozen by what she had just witnessed. The cameraman, however, managed to remain composed and immediately called emergency services. Police arrived quickly, interviewed witnesses, secured the scene, launched a search for Emilio. His vehicle was soon discovered abandoned on the outskirts of the city. Emilio was gone, and so was the weapon. The murder of Maritza, following so closely after her daughter's death, became national news. Emilio was now a fugitive, considered armed and extremely dangerous. A massive manhunt began. Eventually, FBI agents received a tip that a man matching Emilio's description was traveling on a bus bound for Los Angeles. Authorities intercepted the bus in Texas. The bus was full of passengers. When Emilio realized law enforcement was approaching, he drew his weapon. Panic erupted, and passengers fled the bus. Fortunately, no one else was harmed. Emilio, then 34 years old, was quickly subdued and taken into custody. He was transported to the Midland County Detention Center. Footage of Maritza's final moments circulated across the world. Many media outlets have reported on this story as that of a distraught father seeking revenge on his ex-wife, whom he believes is the reason his daughter took her own life, and for preventing him from being involved in her life. However, those familiar with the family's history strongly disagreed. They argued that what the cameras truly captured was not revenge, but a brutal act of domestic violence rooted in obsession and control. This narrative deeply angered Maritza's husband, Armando, who worked tirelessly to clear his late wife's name. Armando described Emilio not as a devoted father, but as a stalker. After his release from prison, Emilio began relentlessly harassing Maritza, who was simply trying to move on with her life. Armando detailed numerous incidents that painted Emilio as unstable and dangerous. He emphasized that Maritza had sought legal protection, but her request for a restraining order had been denied, an omission that would later prove fatal. Armando firmly denied all allegations that Maritza had ever physically abused Joandra. He rejected claims that she had slapped her daughter upon learning of the pregnancy, calling them outright fabrications invented by a man desperate to justify his obsession. According to Armando, Maritza did scold her daughter at times, especially when overwhelmed or confused, but she never resorted to violence. Most chilling of all, Armando revealed that Maritza had lived in constant fear of Emilio. So convinced was she that he would eventually kill her, especially after the restraining order was denied. That fear, tragically, was not misplaced. After his arrest, Emilio initially refused to cooperate with law enforcement or speak to journalists. For nearly a month, he maintained complete silence. Eventually, however, he agreed to speak publicly, largely repeating the same version of events he had told from the beginning. Around this time, both Maritza's parents and Emilio's parents entered the public discussion. Members of both families described Emilio as a volatile and aggressive man. According to relatives, during his first marriage in Cuba, he had repeatedly threatened to kill his wife. Several family members from both sides believed Emilio suffered from serious mental health problems. This view was indirectly supported even by his own parents, who admitted that their son had long struggled with emotional instability. Emilio's father recalled that while living in Havana, Emilio had been considered a below-average student and was forced to repeat the 4th grade. By the age of 16, his behavioral problems had noticeably intensified, though the family declined to provide specific details. Maritza's husband, Armando, later stated that his wife had initially wanted to preserve a peaceful relationship between Emilio and their daughter, even after relocating to the United States. However, Emilio's uncontrollable temper and unprovoked aggression made this impossible. Eventually, Maritza abandoned any hope of reconciliation, believing that continued contact posed a serious danger. As public debate intensified, Maritza was laid to rest beside her daughter, her grave located only a few steps from the spot where Emilio had murdered her. As additional information about Emilio's past came to light, many began to suspect that he had suffered from untreated mental illness for much of his life. Those issues were believed to have worsened during his incarceration in Cuba, regardless of any psychiatric treatment he may have received. Nevertheless, the public overwhelmingly wanted justice. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for January 1993, but the case was repeatedly delayed. It was not until January 19, 2000, nearly 7 years later, that a jury was finally seated. Throughout those years, Emilio Núñez's defense attorneys employed extensive delaying tactics. They repeatedly sought to have him declared legally insane, filed numerous motions, and demanded additional psychiatric evaluations, significantly prolonging the process. Emilio himself proved difficult to work with. He dismissed several attorneys, refusing to follow their legal advice, although an insanity defense appeared to be the most logical strategy given his mental health history. Emilio rejected it outright. He insisted on maintaining his narrative and portraying himself as a wronged father driven by grief. Tensions between Emilio and his legal team escalated to such an extent that he reportedly spat on one of his attorneys, prompting the lawyer to withdraw from the case. Over time, the murder of Maritza Martin became the oldest unresolved homicide case in the county, remaining in legal limbo for nearly 7 years. When the trial finally began, Emilio continued to claim that he had been overwhelmed by grief and mistreated by authorities. One of the first people targeted by his accusations was journalist Ingrid Cruz. Emilio alleged that she had exploited him for a sensational story, claiming he had been emotionally vulnerable and manipulated. His attorneys echoed this argument, portraying Ingrid as someone who deliberately asked provocative questions to incite his emotional breakdown. The defense even suggested that Ingrid had somehow orchestrated events so that Maritza and Emilio would be present at the cemetery simultaneously. However, no evidence supported these claims. Investigators concluded that the encounter was nothing more than a tragic coincidence. The trial lasted nearly a week. Despite the defense's attempts to shift blame onto the media, the evidence against Emilio was overwhelming. When the jury retired to deliberate, they returned with a guilty verdict in just 40 minutes. At sentencing, Emilio Núñez was given life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As he was escorted from the courtroom, he held up a handwritten sign declaring that he had not received a fair trial and told jurors that he would one day return to tell the real truth. Every appeal he later filed was denied. Alvin Lickness, a beloved father and grandfather, was 66 years old at the time. He was a man of authority, respect, both within his family and throughout his professional life. With retirement approaching, Alvin eagerly looked forward to beginning a new chapter, one filled with freedom after years of responsibility. His wife, Kathy Lickness, aged 53, was the heart of the family. She was not only a devoted wife but also her daughter's closest confidant. Her caring and nurturing nature allowed her to create a warm, inviting home for everyone she loved. Park Hill had been their home for many years, but they had recently decided it was time to downsize. They were preparing for a move to Edmonton, planning a more modest living arrangement as they entered retirement. Alvin and Kathy stood on the threshold of enjoying this long-awaited stage of life. They listed their house for sale, along with several pieces of furniture and household items. Their daughter, Jennifer O'Brien, visited her parents' home one final time with her children, including her cheerful 5-year-old son, Nathan. In just 1 week, her parents were scheduled to leave this house permanently. Jennifer felt a quiet sadness. This was the place where she grew up and spent her childhood with her siblings. Alvin and Kathy had also secured an apartment in Mazatlan, Mexico, where they planned to spend the winter enjoying the warm sun before eventually moving on to Edmonton. But they would never have the chance to enjoy their golden years. Just 1 day later, their hopes and plans vanished into a nightmare that engulfed everything around them. Nathan O'Brien was a lively child with a cherubic face, perpetually tousled, sun-kissed hair. He was the middle child among Jennifer's 3 children. Known for his love of superhero costumes and his friendly, outgoing nature, Nathan was adored by nearly everyone he met. He easily made friends with both children and adults. Nathan possessed an endless curiosity for the world around him, always eager to explore something new. Jennifer and the children spent a pleasant day at the family home in Park Hill. As the evening approached and darkness settled in, Jennifer decided to stay a little longer rather than drive immediately with 3 tired children. Nathan, worn out from playing outdoors, fell asleep almost instantly. At approximately 11:00 p.m., Jennifer decided to take her other children home, leaving Nathan asleep beside his grandmother. With plans to return for him in the morning, Nathan had long wished to spend the night with his grandparents, and Jennifer didn't want to deny him that simple joy. On the morning of June 30, 2014, Jennifer arrived at her parents' home to pick up her son, unaware that she was about to witness something beyond comprehension. The front door was standing wide open. As she cautiously looked inside, she saw pools of blood, and a heavy, metallic odor filled the air. Blood appeared everywhere. On the beds, the walls, the floors, and throughout the hallway, a dark trail of sneaker prints and smeared, bloody streaks suggested that someone had been dragged through the house. The most devastating sight of all was a small child's handprint pressed against the wall, as if the boy had leaned on it to steady himself. Jennifer couldn't find her parents or her 5-year-old son anywhere in the house. She immediately called her husband, telling him she believed her entire family had been killed and their bodies taken away. Shaking and overwhelmed, Jennifer then dialed emergency services and repeated the same message. The dispatcher instructed her to return to her car and lock the doors immediately. In case the person responsible was still inside the house or nearby, Jennifer sat behind the steering wheel, staring at the home where she had spent so many happy moments with her family. The image of the small handprint on the wall replayed endlessly in her mind. Police officers arrived quickly and entered the house. They conducted a thorough search of every room, but no bodies were found. Alvin and Kathy Lickness, along with little Nathan, had vanished without a trace. An Amber Alert was soon issued. Despite the horrific condition of the house, investigators held on to hope that the three had been abducted and were being held somewhere alive. Law enforcement officers collected DNA samples throughout the Lickness home but initially found no fingerprints or DNA belonging to an obvious suspect. During the forensic examination, investigators discovered a tooth inside the residence, believed to belong to Alvin Lickness. Blood found on a pair of heavy dumbbells in the garage was later confirmed to match his DNA. Investigators also noted that a lock on a side door had been damaged, suggesting that the attacker may have entered the house that way during the night. Police questioned approximately 200 people who had attended the estate sale held at the home shortly before the disappearance, as hundreds of officers searched tirelessly for the missing family and found no trace of them anywhere. Investigators were forced to return to the starting point, the Lickness home. Detectives considered the possibility that Nathan may have witnessed something terrifying and tried to hide. They carefully searched every closet, storage space, and area beneath the beds, anywhere a frightened child might conceal himself, but found nothing. For weeks, police continued to believe that Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan might be alive somewhere, and that the injuries sustained in the home might not have been fatal. As time passed, however, that hope began to fade. Despite extensive searches, no bodies were found. It became increasingly clear that this was not a kidnapping but a brutal attack on three members of the same family. The person responsible remained at large, Nathan's parents, unwilling to accept the possibility that their son had passed away. Contacted him directly through televised appeals. They reminded Nathan that he was a superhero, telling him he was brave, strong, and could handle anything. They promised they would find him and bring him home. Jennifer, speaking through tears, begged her son not to be afraid. The people watching her desperate request were touched. They didn't know for sure if the child was still alive. The public shared in the family's anguish, feeling profound sympathy but powerless to help. The Amber Alert failed to produce any immediate, concrete results. Over the course of several days, police received more than 1,300 tips from across the region. Residents of nearby homes and businesses did everything they could to assist the investigation, voluntarily submitting hours of surveillance footage recorded during the night in question. Detectives painstakingly reviewed hundreds of hours of video footage, searching for anything out of place. Eventually, something subtle yet troubling emerged. On the night Alvin and Kathy Lickness, along with their 5-year-old grandson Nathan O'Brien, disappeared, a vehicle was seen repeatedly driving through the Park Hill neighborhood. In one frame, a figure appeared lingering near the Lickness residence in the early morning hours. Shortly afterward, a pickup truck was captured traveling north, away from Calgary. In the bed of the truck was a large object concealed beneath a white covering. Police quickly released flyers showing an image of a late 1982 to early 1990s green Ford F-150 pickup truck, believed to have been present on the Lickness Street that night. Investigators were eager to identify both the vehicle and its driver, suspecting they could hold crucial information about the disappearance of Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan. Publicizing the image proved to be a pivotal decision. A woman who recognized the truck contacted authorities. The caller was Patty Douglas, and the truck belonged to her brother, Douglas Garland, 56. Douglas Garland had a long, troubling history. In his youth, he was expelled from medical school after being caught cheating. Over the years, he had been repeatedly arrested for weapons-related offenses and assaults, though charges were often dropped or never pursued, allowing him to evade lasting consequences. In 1992, Douglas was convicted after police discovered a methamphetamine lab on his rural property. To avoid arrest and imprisonment, he fled to British Columbia, where he assumed the identity of a teenager who had died in a car crash. Under this false identity, Douglas lived undetected for several years, working in a laboratory, later collecting unemployment benefits while concealing his true name. In 2000, authorities uncovered the deception. Douglas was arrested and ultimately sentenced to 6 months in prison for banned substances-related offenses and identity theft. Psychological assessments at the time characterized him as mentally unstable but not prone to violent behavior. Based on those evaluations, he served only his sentence and was released. In July 2014, police detained Douglas Garland once again, this time at a bus stop in Calgary, citing an outstanding charge related to document forgery. Douglas refused to cooperate and provided no information to investigators. Let's get back to the case. Given the fear that the Lickness couple and Nathan might still be alive and in danger, police authorized an urgent search of Douglas's rural property, invoking an emergency legal exception rather than waiting for a full search warrant. An emergency response team launched what was initially treated as a potential hostage rescue operation, storming the over 16-hectare farm where Douglas lived with his elderly parents. Investigators believed that a rural property offered the greatest opportunity to conceal victims. Despite an intensive search, neither the missing family members nor any bodies were found. One detail, however, drew attention: a barrel near a greenhouse that was still smoldering inside. Officers found only ash, no blood, no identifiable remains, and no immediate physical evidence. With no grounds to hold him at that time, Douglas Garland was released on bail under strict conditions, including an order not to return to the farm. Soon after, police obtained a comprehensive search warrant. More than 300 officers meticulously combed the property, surrounding fields, and nearby wetlands, while forensic specialists focused on the structures themselves. Deep within the basement, investigators uncovered disturbing materials, including books and manuals containing graphic and violent imagery. Further searches revealed boxes filled with restraints, some small enough to fit a child's wrists. Additional items included hacksaw blades, leather straps, bone saws, knives, firearms, even a straitjacket. Authorities also discovered a computer hard drive hidden beneath the rafters in the basement. The hard drive contained an extensive collection of material related to violence. Gathered through meticulous online research, Douglas had downloaded numerous documents and instructions from the internet, including information on how to attack victims in the early morning hours to maximize the element of surprise, descriptions of painful methods of torture, and guides explaining how to kill without experiencing emotional involvement. The hard drive also contained disturbing images related to Douglas's personal obsessions and fantasies. On shelves nearby, investigators found books focused on poisoning and violent crime. Among them were photographs involving adults wearing diapers, with their hands and feet restrained, some appearing unconscious or possibly deceased. Investigators also uncovered a kit designed for impersonating a woman in the basement. It included silicone breast prostheses, 2 long blonde wigs, racks of women's clothing, and an extensive shoe collection consisting of 89 pairs of boots, shoes, sneakers that fit Douglas's feet. One empty shoebox found in the closet drew particular attention. The sole pattern printed on the box could have been compared to an imprint found at the Lickness home, but the corresponding pair of shoes was missing. Meanwhile, Douglas violated the conditions of his release and returned to the farmhouse without notifying Calgary police. Detectives monitoring his movements believed he intended to destroy or conceal evidence hidden in the basement. His second arrest occurred as Douglas attempted to move through dense trees and thick brush, while a police helicopter hovered overhead. He was formally charged with the murders of Nathan O'Brien, Catherine "Kathy" Lickness, and Alvin Lickness. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since their disappearance, and although no bodies had yet been recovered, Prosecutors proceeded based on an overwhelming volume of evidence. More than 1,400 individual items collected during the investigation. At that stage, it had not yet been definitively proven that Douglas Garland was the man who carried out the brutal attack on Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan. The investigation continued without pause. Detectives decided to re-examine the contents of a smoldering barrel that had been noticed during the initial search of the farm. As forensic specialists carefully sifted through the ashes, they made a chilling discovery. Among the remains were a child's tooth, charred human tissue, a metal eyeglass frame, and numerous fragments of human bone. A subsequent investigation revealed a layered history between Douglas and the Lickness family, stretching back many years. Patty Douglas, Douglas's sister and the woman who alerted police about the pickup truck, was the common-law wife of Alan Lickness, one of Alvin and Kathy's sons. This family connection drew immediate attention from investigators. It soon emerged that Alvin and Douglas had worked together years earlier. In 2006, Alvin, a successful businessman, was seeking technical assistance for a project, and Alan suggested Douglas as a potential collaborator. Douglas, who possessed some technical knowledge of mechanical engineering, began working with Alvin on the development of an industrial pump for the oil and gas industry. The pump itself was Alvin's invention, and Douglas was hired to help refine, improve certain aspects of the design. However, the project was never commercialized. By early 2007, the working relationship came to an end. After losing his position, Douglas became increasingly resentful. The termination appeared to fuel a deep-seated anger that lingered for years, gradually hardening into bitterness. Investigators think Douglas's anger built up over time until he violently destroyed what he blamed for his humiliation. While there was no evidence that Nathan had been a specific target, authorities believed Douglas was unwilling to leave any witnesses behind. His actions showed no regard for age or innocence. His focus was on revenge. In January 2017, Douglas Garland stood trial in a packed Calgary courtroom, where he pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. Throughout the proceedings, he filed no motions and remained largely expressionless. The trial drew national attention, becoming one of the most closely followed criminal cases in Canada, as the public struggled to comprehend the brutality of the crime. Just one day before their disappearance, Alvin and Kathy Lickness had held an estate sale at their Park Hill home, preparing to sell the property and downsize. Douglas, who had harbored resentment toward Alvin for years over the failed pump project and the associated patent, appeared to seize this moment. Investigators believe, in the early hours of June 30, 2014, Douglas gained entry to the Lickness home by drilling through the lock on a side door. Instructions on how to defeat such locks were later found on his computer. While the household slept, Douglas went to the master bedroom, where Alvin was resting, and struck him multiple times with a heavy blunt object. He then moved to the guest bedroom, where Kathy and 5-year-old Nathan were sleeping. DNA evidence confirmed that both were attacked there. The extent of blood loss indicated that Kathy also suffered a severe blow from a blunt instrument. The precise cause of Nathan's injuries could not be determined, but forensic evidence clearly showed that he had been bleeding. Despite the extensive bloodshed inside the house, forensic experts concluded that all 3 victims were still alive when Douglas dragged them from their beds and forced them out of the home. Investigators believed he transported them in the back of his pickup truck, bound and concealed beneath a white covering later observed in surveillance footage. No usable fingerprints or DNA belonging to Douglas were found at the residence. Consistent with evidence that he had studied detailed online instructions on how to avoid detection, Douglas then drove the victims to his parents' rural farm near Airdrie, located more than 30 kilometers from the Lickness home. Investigators later determined that Nathan and his grandparents were subjected to extreme violence at the property. DNA belonging to all 3 victims was recovered from multiple tools found on the farm, including meat hooks, bone saws, and knives. Their genetic material was also discovered on the exterior of a pair of rubber boots near one of the outbuildings. Inside that structure, a blood-stained light switch contained DNA matching both Alvin and Kathy Lickness. A forensic computer specialist testified about the discovery of photographs of Kathy and Alvin among deleted files recovered from a hard drive belonging to Douglas. The evidence suggested that Douglas had been monitoring the lives of those he considered his enemies. Likely through publicly available information and social media platforms, Douglas's own mother also took the stand and testified against her son. She described him as a solitary man who had no close friends, though she added that he was intelligent, enjoyed reading, and helped around the family home. She testified that Douglas had earned a Bachelor of Science degree, later enrolled at the University of Alberta, but studied there for only a short period before suffering a nervous breakdown. When she later saw a television report about the disappearance of the Lickness family and mentioned it to Douglas, he reportedly said that he did not want to talk about Alvin. She also stated that she did not hear her son leave the house that night and therefore could not provide specific details about his movements. As expected, the defense argued that there was no direct forensic or scientific evidence placing Douglas Garland inside the Lickness home on the night of the attack. Defense counsel emphasized that no eyewitness had seen Douglas commit the murders and that there was no definitive proof showing how or why the three victims had been killed. According to the defense, the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. On February 6, 2017, near the conclusion of the trial, prosecutors presented what they described as a pivotal piece of evidence, one discovered purely by chance. At 9:30 a.m. on July 1, 2014, the day after the attack at the Lickness residence, a small aircraft operated by an aerial mapping company was flying over airspace near Airdrie, Alberta, conducting routine photographic surveys of the area and surrounding communities north of Calgary. The aircraft captured images every 3 seconds and, by extraordinary coincidence, recorded 2 photographs that would later be introduced in court and significantly strengthen the case against Douglas. The images appeared to show 3 human figures lying face down on the ground near several outbuildings south of the main farmhouse. 2 of the figures were clearly adults, unclothed except for white material wrapped around their waists. Experts were able to estimate their approximate heights, one about 6 feet 2 inches, another about 5 feet 6 inches. A third, much smaller figure was visible nearby, lying on its side in the grass close to a burn barrel. The prosecution suggested that the smaller figure was a child. The pilot who operated the aircraft testified that when he flew over the same area approximately 26 hours later, the figures were no longer visible in the photographs. In this tragic case, the silence of the victims spoke volumes. No intact bodies were ever recovered, only fragments. The sole physical confirmation of their deaths was found among the ashes in the burn barrel charred tissue, bone fragments, and remains belonging to Nathan O'Brien and his grandparents. Investigators concluded that after dismembering the bodies, the killer attempted to destroy them by fire in a crude and prolonged process resembling cremation. As these horrifying details were presented in court, Douglas remained outwardly unmoved, at times appearing to take notes. He showed no visible signs of remorse. After several hours of emotionally devastating testimony and approximately 10 hours of jury deliberation, a verdict was reached. The judge presiding over the Calgary triple murder case imposed the harshest sentence allowed under Canadian law. Douglas Garland, convicted of the first-degree murders of Nathan O'Brien, Alvin Lickness, and Kathy Lickness, was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, with parole ineligibility periods totaling 75 years. In practical terms, Douglas would be 129 years old before he could even apply for parole. In the period following Douglas's sentencing, reports indicated that life in custody was far from easy for him. As the details of the crimes became widely known among other inmates, he was subjected to hostility and abuse because of the brutal killing of 3 innocent people, including a 5-year-old child, over a grievance that dated back several years. His actions had marked him as one of the most despised offenders in the prison system. The devastating events of the case left a deep and lasting impact on the family and on society as a whole. The void created by the loss of Alvin, Kathy, and young Nathan was immeasurable. The consequences of this tragedy extended far beyond the courtroom, embedding themselves in the hearts of everyone who had known and loved them. No words can fully capture the pain endured by Nathan's parents. Jennifer and Rod O'Brien continue to face this loss day after day, raising their two sons and learning how to live in a world where their little superhero is no longer by their side. Amid unimaginable grief, Rod and Jennifer found a way to transform their pain into something meaningful. In Nathan's memory, they established the Nathan O'Brien Children's Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving the lives of children facing hardship. The foundation was created to honor Nathan by giving other children opportunities, hope, and support, things his parents believe every child deserves. Nathan loved sports, and in his honor, the foundation organizes annual sporting events for children, including hockey programs. Imagining how much joy he would have found in being part of those games. Another thing Nathan loved dearly was talking with his father before bedtime. Their final conversation remains etched in Rod's memory. That night, Nathan asked what heaven was like, an unusual question for a 5-year-old. He spoke about being a superhero, flying through the sky and cutting through the clouds with his hands. He told his father that one day he would meet his parents in heaven. In hindsight, Rod has often wondered whether his son somehow sensed what was to come. Nathan's mother, Jennifer, watches with tears in her eyes as her son's friends grow older, knowing she will never see her own boy grow into adulthood. The Lickness and O'Brien case remains one of the most tragic chapters in Calgary's history, leaving a permanent scar not only on the city, but on the entire country. The deaths of Alvin, Kathy, and little Nathan stands as a painful reminder of how fragile life can be, and of the importance of cherishing those we love. There are places where nothing seems to happen, not because nothing does, but because no one is looking closely enough. In the middle of the New Mexico desert sits a quiet town called Truth or Consequences, a place so still and ordinary that even silence feels normal. People come and go, time drifts, and when someone disappears, it doesn't always raise alarms. In 1999, a woman vanished. No immediate search, no urgency, just another absence slipping quietly through the cracks. Until one day, she came back. Running, injured, terrified, emerging from somewhere no one even knew existed. But what she escaped wasn't just a crime scene, it was something built, something planned, something hidden in plain sight. And the moment she spoke, everything began to unravel. Because the real question was never what happened to her, it was how many others never made it out. The town does not announce danger. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, sits low against the desert horizon. Sparse streets, faded signage, a place where time stretches and sound travels farther than it should. According to regional records, the population barely crossed a few thousand in the late 1990s. It was not the kind of place where crimes echoed loudly. Most things passed quietly. That was part of the problem. In July 1999, a woman named Cynthia Vigil would later describe being held against her will inside a trailer on the outskirts of this town. At that moment, no one outside knew. No calls were made. No alarms were raised. The desert absorbed everything. She had last been seen alive in Albuquerque. That is a fact confirmed through investigative records. What happened between that sighting and her arrival in Truth or Consequences was, at first, fragmented. According to her later testimony, she was abducted, restrained, and transported across state lines. But at the time, she was simply gone. The atmosphere around her disappearance carried no urgency. Not immediately. Missing adults, especially those living on the margins, often did not trigger large-scale searches. That pattern appears repeatedly in law enforcement archives from the period. It created gaps. And gaps allowed time. Inside the trailer, time worked differently. Investigators would later document that the location sat isolated, partially obscured, and structurally unremarkable. No outward signs of violence. No noise complaints filed. Nothing to suggest what was happening inside. This detail would become critical later. The crimes did not rely on secrecy alone, they relied on invisibility. What kind of place allows something like this to exist unnoticed? Cynthia Vigil would eventually answer that question herself, but not yet. At this stage, she was still inside. Still enduring. Still part of a story no one had begun to tell. And then, something changed. Not in the town. Not in the system. In her. The break did not come from outside, it came from within the room. On March 22, 1999, according to police records, Cynthia Vigil managed to escape from the trailer where she had been held. The details she later gave were consistent, physical, and immediate. Bruises. Restraint marks. Signs of prolonged assault documented by medical personnel. These were not abstract claims, they were visible, measurable, and urgent. She ran naked through the desert. That is not interpretation. That is fact, supported by witness accounts and responding officers. She reached a nearby residence and asked for help. The people inside called authorities. Within minutes, the silence that had surrounded the trailer began to fracture. What kind of fear drives someone to run into open land with nothing? When deputies arrived, Vigil told them she had been held captive for days. She described chains. A bed fitted with restraints. Recorded audio played to her, detailing acts that had not yet happened. According to her testimony, the voice was calm. Controlled. Instructional. That detail would later become one of the most disturbing elements in the case. Because it suggested planning. Not impulse. Not escalation. Design. Inside her account, investigators found structure. She described a system: abduction, confinement, assault, release, or something worse. At that stage, law enforcement did not yet know how far the pattern extended. But they knew enough to act quickly. They followed her back to the trailer. The location matched her description. Remote. Quiet. Ordinary on the outside. But inside, according to search records, officers encountered items that aligned with her statement: restraints, tools, and an environment that appeared deliberately constructed. Nothing chaotic. Everything placed with purpose. One fact became immediately clear: this was not a first-time crime scene. The emotional atmosphere shifted rapidly. What began as a single survivor's report now suggested the possibility of multiple victims. Investigators had to consider a question that would shape everything that followed. If she escaped, how many others had not? Cynthia Vigil's survival changed the direction of the case. Without her, the trailer might have remained just another structure in the desert. With her, it became evidence. And evidence leads to people. The name connected to that trailer would soon emerge, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. David Parker Ray. The name did not arrive with shock. It arrived with recognition. David Parker Ray was not a stranger to truth or consequences. According to local records and investigative reporting, he had lived in the area for years. He worked as a mechanic for the New Mexico State Parks Department. He owned property. He spoke to neighbors. He blended into the slow rhythm of the town. There was no immediate reason to suspect him. That is what made the next step difficult. When law enforcement connected the trailer to Ray, they were not approaching an unknown figure, they were approaching someone who had existed in plain sight. A man described by some as quiet, by others as reserved. No clear history of violent crime that would predict what investigators were beginning to uncover. How does someone build something so controlled, without being seen? According to investigative files, Ray lived a largely compartmentalized life. He had relationships, including with a woman named Cindy Hendy. She would later become a central figure in the case. But at this stage, she was simply part of his environment, another name, another connection. Nothing overtly alarming. Not yet. But patterns began to form. Witnesses, interviewed after Vigil's escape, described Ray as someone who preferred isolation. His property sat in a location that allowed distance from neighbors. The trailer itself was not unusual in structure, but its placement offered privacy. That detail would later become critical in understanding how his activities remained concealed. Inside law enforcement briefings, the tone shifted from reactive to investigative. They began building a profile, not psychological speculation, but behavioral mapping. Routine. Access. Opportunity. Ray had tools. He had space. He had time. According to case records, he also had knowledge of mechanical systems and construction, skills that could be applied beyond his official work. Then came the evidence already collected from the trailer. Items found inside did not suggest spontaneity. They suggested repetition, preparation, a system that had been refined over time. Investigators were no longer asking whether a crime had occurred. They were asking how long it had been happening, and whether Ray had done it alone. Cynthia Vigil's testimony placed him directly at the center. She identified him, described his voice, his behavior, his methods. Her account aligned with the physical evidence recovered. That alignment gave investigators something crucial: corroboration. But there was still a gap. No confirmed timeline. No known number of victims. No clear beginning. Only a man who had lived quietly in a quiet town, and a trailer that suggested something far more deliberate than anyone had imagined. The investigation was no longer about one escape. It was about uncovering a pattern that may have existed for years. And inside that pattern, something waited to be fully revealed. The structure did not resist discovery. It revealed itself. When investigators entered the trailer linked to David Parker Ray, they were not stepping into a chaotic crime scene. According to official search records and later court testimony, what they found was organized, deliberate in layout, specific in function. The space had a purpose, and that purpose unfolded piece by piece. At the center was a bed. Not an ordinary one. It was modified, equipped with restraints, chains positioned with mechanical precision. Nearby, tools were arranged, not scattered, not improvised, but placed in a way that suggested repeated use. This detail became critical in the investigation. Nothing indicated a single, isolated event. Everything suggested a system. What kind of mind constructs a place like this over time? Among the most significant pieces of evidence recovered were audio recordings, cassette tapes. According to investigators, one of these tapes contained a pre-recorded message, spoken in a calm, controlled tone. The voice, identified as Ray's, described procedures. Not in anger. Not in chaos. But with clarity. The tape outlined what victims would experience. It explained restraints. It referenced prior victims, though without names. It suggested that what was happening had happened before. According to law enforcement, this recording became one of the most disturbing elements of the case, not because of what it said alone, but because of how it said it. Measured. Methodical. Planned. Forensic teams processed the trailer thoroughly. Fibers, biological traces, fingerprints. Some evidence supported Cynthia Vigil's account directly. Other elements hinted at additional individuals, though not all could be conclusively identified. That uncertainty created tension inside the investigation. Evidence pointed outward, but not always clearly. No confirmed bodies were found at the site. That fact would shape everything that followed. Because it introduced a problem. How do you prove the full extent of a pattern without physical remains? Still, the trailer itself became a form of testimony. It showed preparation, control, repetition. It demonstrated that whatever had occurred inside was not accidental and not brief. It had been built. And anything built over time leaves traces, not just of actions, but of intention. Investigators began expanding their scope. They were no longer looking only at the trailer. They were looking beyond it, into records, missing persons cases, and the people connected to Ray. Because a system like this rarely exists in isolation. And sometimes, the structure is only the beginning. The story did not remain centered on one man. It began to widen. As investigators dug deeper into David Parker Ray's life, another name moved from the background into focus: Cindy Hendy. According to court records and police interviews, she was not a distant acquaintance. She was present. Close enough to be inside the same spaces. Close enough to witness what others never saw. And, according to testimony, close enough to participate. Hendy was arrested shortly after Cynthia Vigil's escape. Under questioning, her statements would shift. At times, she minimized her role. At others, she acknowledged involvement in certain acts. Investigators faced a familiar challenge: how much was truth, and how much was protection? What does complicity look like when it lives beside silence? According to the investigation file, Hendy admitted to being present during Vigil's captivity. She described elements of the trailer that matched what law enforcement had already documented. That alignment strengthened the case, but it also introduced a deeper concern. If one person knew, could others have known too? The inquiry expanded beyond Hendy. Detectives examined Ray's social circle, his past relationships, and any individuals who may have had access to the property. Among those mentioned in investigative threads was Ray's daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray. She was later charged in connection with a separate abduction case involving a woman named Kelly Garrett in 1996. Garrett survived, and her testimony added another layer, suggesting that the pattern extended back years before Vigil's escape. That timeline mattered, because it indicated repetition across multiple incidents, involving more than one person. Still, the evidence remained uneven. Some accounts overlapped. Others conflicted. Certain claims could not be fully verified. Investigators had to separate what was provable from what was possible. And in doing so, they confronted a difficult reality: networks of harm are rarely clean or fully visible. They are fragmented, hidden inside relationships, protected by doubt. Plea negotiations began to emerge as a strategic necessity. According to court proceedings, Hendy eventually entered a plea agreement, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. It was not a resolution, it was a trade. Information for time. But even with cooperation, gaps remained. No complete list of victims. No confirmed number. Only fragments, statements, evidence, patterns. The case was no longer about a single location or a single act. It had become something broader. A system, possibly involving multiple people, operating over an unknown period, partially revealed, but not fully understood. And somewhere within that system, there were still missing pieces. Pieces that may never be recovered. The evidence pointed outward. But it did not always land. As investigators expanded beyond the trailer and the known survivors, a pattern began to surface, one built not only on what was found, but on what was missing. According to law enforcement records and later investigative reporting, multiple unsolved disappearances in New Mexico and surrounding states were reviewed for possible connections to David Parker Ray. Women who vanished. Cases that had gone quiet. Files that had never been closed, but never resolved. One name frequently examined was that of Marie Parker, who disappeared in 1997 after last being seen in Albuquerque. Another was Stephanie Wilson, who vanished under similarly unclear circumstances. These cases, among others, were revisited. Timelines compared. Locations mapped. But despite circumstantial overlaps, no direct forensic evidence conclusively linked Ray to these disappearances. That distinction mattered. Because suspicion is not proof. How many stories remain suspended between possibility and certainty? Investigators also reviewed Ray's own statements. According to interrogation transcripts referenced in case summaries, he made claims about multiple victims, numbers that ranged widely, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes inconsistent. At one point, he allegedly suggested involvement in dozens of deaths. But those claims were never substantiated with physical evidence. No bodies were recovered. No confirmed burial sites identified. Searches were conducted. Land surrounding his property was examined. Reservoirs, desert areas, and remote locations were considered. But each search ended the same way, with absence. And absence complicates justice. Without remains, without DNA confirmation, without a definitive chain linking a victim to a suspect, cases remain open, but unresolved. For families, that creates a different kind of grief. One without closure. One without answers. Still, the pattern could not be ignored. Ray had the means. The space. The documented behavior. Survivors who described a system that implied repetition. Investigators were left balancing two realities, what they could prove, and what they strongly suspected. The emotional weight of that divide was significant. Because every unproven case carries a question. Not just what happened, but whether it will ever be known. In the absence of certainty, the investigation moved forward with what it had. Prosecutors focused on charges that could be supported. Survivors whose stories aligned with evidence. Crimes that could stand in court. But beneath that strategy, something remained unresolved. A possibility that extended beyond the limits of proof, and that possibility would follow the case into the courtroom. The courtroom did not hold all the answers. It held what could be proven. By the early 2000s, David Parker Ray faced multiple charges tied to kidnapping, sexual assault, and torture. According to court records, the prosecution's case relied heavily on survivor testimony, especially that of Cynthia Vigil, alongside the physical evidence recovered from the trailer. The structure of the case was clear: establish a pattern, demonstrate control, and anchor it in verifiable acts. But there was a limit. No murder charges were filed. Not because investigators did not suspect more, but because they could not prove it beyond reasonable doubt. Without bodies, without definitive forensic links to deaths, the legal system narrowed its focus to crimes it could substantiate. That decision shaped the entire trial. What does justice look like when parts of the story cannot be told in court? Ray ultimately entered into a plea agreement in 2001. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including kidnapping and torture. In exchange, the possibility of the death penalty was removed. He received a sentence of 224 years in prison. On paper, it was a definitive outcome. A man removed from society for the remainder of his life. But even that outcome carried an unfinished edge. Because the broader questions, the suspected victims, the missing women, the scale of the alleged crimes, remained outside the verdict. The courtroom addressed what it could confirm. It did not resolve what it could not. Cindy Hendy, his accomplice, also faced trial. She accepted a plea deal, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. Her role, while established, was also bounded by what could be proven. Again, fragments. Again, limitations. Then, in May 2002, something unexpected occurred. David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in prison. The timing mattered. His death closed off any possibility of further testimony, further interrogation, further clarification. Whatever he knew about alleged victims, about locations, about the full extent of his actions, remained with him. Silence, once again, became part of the case. For investigators and families, that silence was not neutral. It was obstructive. It froze the narrative in place, partially solved, partially obscured. The trial had delivered a sentence. But not closure. And without closure, the case did not end in the courtroom. It lingered. In files. In memories. In unanswered questions. The case did not end with a verdict. It settled into something quieter. After David Parker Ray's death in 2002, the investigation effectively lost its central source of answers. According to law enforcement summaries, no further major breakthroughs followed. The physical evidence had been processed. The testimonies recorded. The legal outcomes finalized. What remained was not an active pursuit, but an enduring uncertainty. Because the scale was never fully measured. How do you understand a crime when its boundaries are unknown? For the survivors, the aftermath was not defined by the courtroom alone. Cynthia Vigil's testimony had been pivotal, but survival carries its own weight. Public records and interviews indicate long-term psychological impact, trauma that does not resolve with sentencing. The same applied to other victims who came forward. Their experiences became part of the official narrative, but also part of a private, ongoing recovery. The community of truth or consequences absorbed the case in a different way. A town that had once seemed distant from major crime found itself tied to one of the most unsettling investigations in modern American criminal history. According to regional reporting, there was no single moment of collective closure. Instead, there was a gradual shift, an awareness that something had existed unnoticed for years. That awareness changed perception. Not just of one man, but of proximity itself. Law enforcement agencies also reflected on the investigation. The case highlighted systemic gaps, particularly in how missing persons cases were prioritized. Many of the potential victims linked to Ray had lived on the margins of society. Their disappearances did not always trigger immediate, large-scale responses. This pattern, documented in multiple reports, raised broader questions about whose cases receive urgency, and whose do not. That is one of the lasting lessons. Because invisibility is not accidental. It is often structured. Despite extensive efforts, no confirmed list of additional victims has ever been established. The allegations, the suspicions, the unverified claims, they remain part of the case, but outside definitive proof. Investigators have acknowledged this limitation publicly. It is not a failure of effort, but a boundary of evidence. And so the story remains partially open. Not in the sense of an active investigation, but in the sense of an incomplete understanding. David Parker Ray was convicted. His crimes, as proven, were severe and systematic. But the full extent of what may have occurred remains uncertain, held between testimony, evidence, and absence. The case leaves behind a quiet, persistent question. Not just about what happened, but about what was never found. And whether, in some cases, truth can exist, without ever being fully seen. On September 27, 2023, an ordinary weekday morning in Croydon, South London, started like any other. The sky was grey, and commuters moved along Wellesley Road as usual, passing bus stops and people in school uniforms. 15-year-old Eliane Andam was among them, walking her familiar route to school, seemingly safe and unnoticed. According to police timelines, she was meeting a friend that morning. There was nothing unusual in her movements. No indication of danger. No signal that this ordinary route would become the final path she would ever walk. Later, witnesses would remember snippets of the event, raised voices and a growing sense of tension. But initially, it seemed like a normal teenage interaction in a public space. Then, everything changed. Around 8:30 a.m., near a busy shopping area, violence broke out. A teenage boy approached Eliane. According to investigators, in just a few seconds, he drew his weapon and attacked her multiple times. The attack happened in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, in a place where people felt secure. The atmosphere shifted instantly, from routine to shock. Emergency services were called. Passers-by froze, some attempting to help, others stepping back in disbelief. Police and paramedics arrived quickly, but the severity of the injuries was overwhelming. Despite efforts at the scene, Eliane Andam was pronounced dead shortly after. A life ended before the day had properly begun. The fact was stark: a 15-year-old girl had been killed on her way to school. The location was public. The act was direct. The timeline was brutally short. But beneath the immediacy of the violence, questions began to surface. What caused the confrontation? Why did it turn deadly? And who was the boy who approached her with a weapon that morning? The investigation would move quickly, but the answers would unfold slowly, layer by layer, through evidence, testimony, and the fragile reconstruction of moments that could no longer be changed. Before the headlines, before the cordon tapes and flashing lights, there was a girl known simply as Eliane. She was 15 years old, a student, a daughter, and a friend. Those who knew her describe her as warm and reliable. In the days after her death, tributes painted a picture of a young woman actively living her life, not just a victim. Teachers remembered her focus, friends her laughter, and her family spoke of the future she was building. The fact remained grounded in records. Eliane Andam was a secondary school student in Croydon, navigating the ordinary pressures of adolescence, education, friendships, identity. There were no indications, according to publicly available reports, that she was involved in anything that would place her at risk of lethal violence. But she is dead. Thinking about her life before her death creates a stark contrast. There were school days, talks with friends, and dreams for the future that will never happen. Her disappearance was sudden and had a huge impact. Her classmates, her community, and especially her family are now faced with a shocking and painful silence. Investigators, meanwhile, began piecing together her final hours not just as a timeline, but as a portrait. Who she was mattered. Because understanding the victim often reveals the contours of the crime itself. There was no evidence suggesting premeditated conflict from her side. No history, as far as publicly confirmed, of ongoing disputes that might explain the escalation. But there was one detail that would soon surface: a seemingly minor disagreement involving a personal item, reportedly a teddy bear. At first glance, it appeared trivial. The kind of conflict that belongs to youth, not violence. Yet, according to early investigative findings, this interaction may have formed the immediate backdrop to what happened on Wellesley Road. A small object. A brief dispute. And somehow, a fatal outcome. Emotionally, the contrast is difficult to reconcile. How does a moment so ordinary lead to something so irreversible? How does a young life, described as kind and grounded, become the center of a homicide investigation within hours? Police would begin interviewing those closest to her, friends, classmates, witnesses who had seen the interaction that morning. Each account added a fragment. Each fragment carried weight. But clarity was still forming. Because beneath the surface of her life, peaceful, structured, hopeful, there had been an encounter. And within that encounter, something had shifted. Something that turned a disagreement into a weapon. What exactly happened between Eli-Ann and the person she met that morning? And how did such a minor conflict spiral into lethal intent? The confrontation unfolded in seconds. According to CCTV footage and witness statements later referenced in court, the events of that morning did not begin as an immediate attack. There was an interaction, brief, tense, and visible to others nearby. Eli-Ann was not alone. She had been meeting a friend, and the situation appeared, at first, to revolve around a personal dispute involving property, reportedly a teddy bear belonging to the suspect's ex-girlfriend. It was a small object. But the tension surrounding it was already present. The boy approached. Identified later as a 17-year-old, he had reportedly come to retrieve the item. Witnesses described the confrontation, not yet violent, but charged. Voices may have been raised. Movements became sharper. The air shifted. Then, without prolonged escalation, the situation broke. According to the prosecution's case, the boy produced a knife he had brought with him. The act was immediate. There was no prolonged struggle, no drawn-out exchange. He lunged forward and stabbed Eli-Ann multiple times. The force and repetition, as later described in forensic findings, suggested intent rather than accident. The location made it more jarring. It happened in daylight, in a public space, near shops and transport routes. People saw it. Some froze. Others shouted. The suddenness created confusion. Was this real, or something unfolding too fast to process? Eli-Ann collapsed. Bystanders attempted to intervene, but the damage had already been done. Emergency calls flooded in. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, working urgently at the scene. But the injuries were critical. Despite intervention, she could not be saved. The attacker fled. That detail would become crucial. CCTV cameras across Croydon captured fragments of his escape, movements through streets, attempts to distance himself from the scene. These recordings would later help police reconstruct not only the attack, but what came immediately after, a transition from confrontation to evasion. The fact pattern was now clearer. A teenage suspect. A weapon was brought to the scene. A targeted attack. A rapid escape. But questions deepened rather than settled. Why bring a knife to what was supposed to be a retrieval? Was this confrontation planned, or did something in those final seconds trigger the violence? And what did the suspect do in the moments after he ran? The investigation, now urgent, began tightening its focus. Witnesses had seen his face. Cameras had captured his route. Time, in this case, was not on his side. Because even as the shock lingered at Wellesley Road, police were already moving to identify him. The response was immediate. Within hours of the attack, the Metropolitan Police shifted from emergency reaction to targeted pursuit. The clarity of the scene, public, witnessed, partially recorded, meant this was not a case that would remain unknown for long. Officers began securing CCTV footage from surrounding streets, transport hubs, and nearby businesses. Each frame became part of a timeline. And the timeline pointed toward a single individual. Witnesses had seen him. Some recognized him. According to investigative reports, the suspect was not a stranger to the group involved. He was connected, indirectly, but meaningfully, to the situation that had unfolded that morning. This was not a random act in the traditional sense. There was a link, however fragile, between victim and attacker. By the afternoon of September 27th, police had identified a 17-year-old male as the primary suspect. The fact marked a turning point. The case now had direction. Officers tracked his movements through CCTV analysis. Footage captured him fleeing the scene, moving quickly through Croydon streets. At one point, he was seen boarding public transport. Each sighting narrowed the search area, building pressure. The assumption was clear: he knew what he had done, and he was trying to get away. Later that same day, police located and arrested him. The arrest, according to official statements, occurred without a major incident. He was taken into custody on suspicion of murder. The speed of this development was notable, not just for efficiency, but for what it suggested. This was not a case built on weeks of uncertainty. The evidence, at least in its early form, had aligned quickly. But speed does not equal simplicity. Inside the investigation room, the questions grew more complex. Detectives began assembling the suspect's profile. His age stood out: 17. Still legally a minor. Yet accused of a deliberate act of fatal violence in public view. They examined his relationship to the dispute. The alleged connection through a former girlfriend. The reported reason for the meeting was a personal item. Each element felt small in isolation. But together, they formed a chain that led directly to the scene. This was no longer just about what happened. It was about who did it, and why. Because if the suspect had brought a knife to that meeting, then intent had to be considered. Preparation. Anticipation. The possibility that this was not a spontaneous loss of control, but something that had been building. Yet, at this stage, much remained unconfirmed. What had he said during questioning? Did he admit to the act, or deny it? And what evidence, beyond witness accounts, could firmly establish motive? The investigation had found its suspect, but the deeper truth, the reason behind the violence, was still unfolding, hidden within conversations, digital traces, and the fragile psychology of youth. The motive did not emerge from darkness. It surfaced from something smaller, almost ordinary. As detectives moved deeper into the case, they turned to the spaces where modern conflicts often leave traces: phones, messages, social media. Conversations that once seemed fleeting were now preserved, recoverable, and subject to scrutiny. And within those digital fragments, a narrative began to form. At the center of it was a dispute. According to the prosecution's case, the conflict involved a teddy bear, an item belonging to the suspect's former girlfriend. It had reportedly come into Eliane's possession, though the exact circumstances were, at times, described differently depending on the account. What remained consistent was this: the suspect wanted it back. On its own, the fact felt almost too minor to carry weight. But context changed everything. Investigators found that communication had taken place prior to the meeting. Messages, according to court disclosures, suggested arrangements had been made to retrieve the item. There was intent, not necessarily violent at first, but deliberate. A time. A place. A reason to meet. The atmosphere around these exchanges, when reconstructed, carried tension beneath the surface. Adolescence often amplifies emotion. Conflict can feel sharper, more immediate. But here, something had escalated beyond what those messages alone could explain. Because one detail stood apart from all others. The suspect arrived with a knife. That fact reframed the entire interaction. It introduced the possibility that the meeting was not simply about retrieving property. That preparation had occurred. That the potential for violence existed before any words were exchanged that morning. Why bring a weapon to a conversation about a personal item? Investigators examined whether there had been prior disagreements, signs of hostility, or threats that could indicate premeditation. Some reports suggested underlying tensions between individuals connected through relationships and social circles. But much of this remained, at least publicly, partially unconfirmed or interpreted through legal argument. Still, the evidence was building. Digital communication established contact. CCTV placed the suspect at the scene. Witnesses described the confrontation. And the weapon, central, undeniable, linked preparation to outcome. Emotionally, the case began to shift from shock to unease. This was no longer just a sudden act of violence. It appeared, increasingly, as a moment shaped by decisions made in advance, choices that turned a minor dispute into something irreversible. And yet, one question lingered beneath all others. Was the intention always to harm? Or did something happen in those final seconds that transformed tension into lethal action? To answer that, investigators would need to look beyond messages and movements. They would need to understand the person behind them. The investigation now turned inward. With the suspect in custody, detectives began the process of building not just a case, but a profile. Who he was mattered. Because within that identity might lie the answer to a question that had followed every stage of the investigation: why did this happen? The accused was 17 years old at the time of the attack. Legally still a minor, yet facing an allegation of murder. According to court proceedings, he had no widely reported history of serious violent offenses. To those outside the case, that detail created a quiet tension. There was no clear, documented pattern that predicted what had occurred on Wellesley Road. And yet, the facts of that morning remained unchanged. He had arranged to meet. He had arrived with a knife. He had used it. Investigators began examining behavioral indicators. How he communicated. How did he react under questioning? Whether there were signs of impulsivity, control, or underlying aggression. Some aspects, according to courtroom disclosures, suggested a level of emotional intensity, responses that may have been shaped by personal relationships and perceived grievances. But much of this existed in a space of interpretation. The atmosphere surrounding his profile was not one of certainty, but of fragments. A young individual, navigating complex social dynamics, whose actions on that day stood in stark contrast to the limited public record of his past. It raised a difficult possibility, that the violence was not the result of a long, visible trajectory, but something that had escalated internally, largely unseen. One detail remained central. He brought the knife. That single fact continued to anchor the prosecution's argument around intent. Because carrying a weapon into a planned meeting requires foresight. It suggests anticipation, not necessarily of the exact outcome, but of the potential for confrontation. The defense, however, would later explore alternative interpretations. Whether the act was spontaneous. Whether the escalation was sudden and unplanned. Whether the presence of the knife, while significant, did not fully define the mental state in those final seconds. Emotionally, the case became more complex. It was no longer only about loss. It was about understanding how a teenager could cross a line so absolute, in such a short span of time. How ordinary conflict could intersect with irreversible action. And beneath that complexity, another question emerged, one that would ultimately be tested in court. Did the suspect intend to kill? Because the answer to that question would determine not only the legal outcome, but how this case would be remembered, as a moment of uncontrolled escalation, or as a deliberate act that began long before the first blow. The courtroom became the final arena where uncertainty would be forced into clarity. Several months after the murder, the case went to trial at the Old Bailey. Initially, the suspect's age had protected his identity. However, as the trial continued, this anonymity was removed, and he was named as Hassan Sentimel. He was 17 years old at the time of the crime. Now, he stood trial before a jury, accused of intentionally committing the act. The prosecution's case was direct. They argued that the killing of Elian Andam was not an accident, not a momentary loss of control, but a deliberate act. They pointed to the sequence of facts: he arranged the meeting, he brought a knife, and he used it repeatedly in a public setting. CCTV footage was presented, showing his movements before and after the attack. Witness testimonies described the confrontation and the sudden escalation. Forensic evidence confirmed the nature and severity of the injuries. Each layer reinforced a central claim: this was intentional violence. The atmosphere in court was controlled, but heavy. Every detail carried a consequence. Every word was measured against the final question the jury would have to answer. Did he mean to kill? The defense approached from a different angle. They did not deny that Sentimo was responsible for the stabbing. Instead, they challenged the interpretation of intent. According to defense arguments, the situation escalated rapidly. Emotions were high. The confrontation was not meant to end in death. They suggested that what happened in those final seconds was not pre-planned murder, but a spontaneous act, one that, while fatal, did not meet the threshold of deliberate intent required for a murder conviction. It was a narrow line, but a critical one. Because in law, intention separates outcomes. The jury was left to weigh not only what happened, but what was meant to happen. They examined the evidence, the knife brought to the scene, the nature of the attack, and the behavior immediately afterward. They listened to accounts of Eliane's final moments. They considered the trajectory, from a dispute over an object to a fatal act carried out in public view. Then came the decision. Hassan Sentimo was found guilty of murder. The verdict established the court's conclusion that the act was intentional. That the presence of the weapon, combined with the nature of the attack, crossed the legal threshold beyond doubt. Emotionally, the outcome carried a dual weight. For Eliane's family, it marked a form of justice, structured, formal, but unable to restore what had been lost. For the defendant, it marked the beginning of a sentence that would define the rest of his life. But even with the verdict delivered, the case did not end in silence. Because beyond the courtroom, another question remained. What does justice mean in a case where both lives, one lost, one condemned, began so young? The verdict closed the legal case. But it did not close the impact. In the weeks and months that followed Eliane Andam's death, her name stayed in the public consciousness, appearing in court documents and conversations throughout Croydon and elsewhere. The community grappled with the fact that a 15-year-old girl had been killed in broad daylight on her way to school, seemingly over a trivial argument. While the facts of the case were clear and the sentencing was pending, the impact of her death resonated far beyond the legal proceedings. Eliane's family shared their grief publicly, speaking deliberately but conveying the immense void her absence left. They portrayed a daughter with a bright future, whose life had purpose and direction. Their loss was tangible, a daily, immediate, and permanent reality that no legal decision could change. The atmosphere in the community reflected a similar tension. There was grief, but also unease. Because the case did not fit comfortably into a distant narrative. It happened in a familiar place. In a setting that people passed through every day. And the individuals involved were not hardened criminals in the traditional sense, they were teenagers. Students. Part of the same social landscape. The fact remained difficult to process. A conflict involving a personal item had escalated into fatal violence, carried out with a weapon brought to the scene. That detail lingered. In response, conversations began to shift toward prevention. Youth violence. Knife crime. The accessibility of weapons. Schools, local authorities, and advocacy groups renewed calls for earlier intervention, identifying risk before it manifests, addressing conflict before it escalates. But prevention, in this context, is not simple. Because what happened to Eliane did not unfold over years of visible warning signs. According to available information, it emerged from a sequence of decisions made within a compressed time frame. A meeting arranged. A weapon is carried. A moment that crossed a line. The question is not only how to respond, but how to recognize. How do systems detect escalation when it hides within ordinary interactions? How do communities intervene when conflict appears small, until it is not? And how many similar moments exist, unresolved, waiting for an outcome that could still be changed? The case leaves behind more than answers. It leaves a pattern. A reminder that violence does not always begin with something large. Sometimes, it begins quietly, within relationships, within pride, within objects that carry meaning disproportionate to their size. And sometimes, by the time it becomes visible, it is already too late. The story of Eli and Andam ends with a conviction, but its echo continues, in policy discussions, in school corridors, in the awareness that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. Because on a normal morning, in a public place, everything changed. And the question that remains is not only what happened, but what might prevent the next moment from unfolding the same way. On August 30th, 2021, Gabby Petito's mother, Nicole Schmidt, received a strange and brief text message. Gabby's family felt it didn't sound like her. Nicole read the message repeatedly, sensing something was amiss. Gabby usually called her grandfather, Grandpa, but the text used his first name. The tone was also unlike Gabby, it was distant and almost robotic. At that moment, Nicole had a feeling that something was wrong. Gabby, 22 years old, had been traveling across the United States with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. Their journey was carefully curated online, sunlit photos, laughter, a van life dream unfolding across national parks. To the public, it looked idyllic. To her family, it was simply Gabby chasing freedom, documenting moments, building something of her own. Then, days passed without contact. Calls went unanswered. Texts unread. For Gabby, who regularly checked in with her family, this absence was not normal. It was a deviation, a break from the routine. On September 1st, 2021, Brian Laundrie returned alone to his parents' home in Northport, Florida. He arrived in the van, the same white Ford Transit that had carried both of them across thousands of miles. Gabby was not with him. According to investigation records, Brian did not report Gabby missing. He did not contact her family. Instead, he retained legal counsel. His silence, protected under the law, would soon become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the case. 10 days later, on September 11th, Gabby was officially reported missing. By then, the timeline had already begun to fracture. The last confirmed sightings. The final messages. The unexplained return. Each piece sat disconnected, waiting for context. Investigators would later examine phone data, witness reports, and surveillance footage. What happened between that final message and Brian's solitary return? The answers, buried somewhere between Wyoming's vast wilderness and a digital trail of fragments, were about to pull investigators, and an entire nation, into a case that was far more complex than it first appeared. Before the silence, there was a story carefully constructed, frame by frame, post by post. Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie presented themselves as young travelers chasing simplicity. A white van. Open roads. National parks stretching endlessly under western skies. Their YouTube channel, modest but hopeful, showed smiling faces, shared dreams, and the promise of a life unbound. It was the kind of narrative that drew admiration, freedom distilled into images. But behind the curated calm, there were fractures. According to police records from Moab, Utah, on August 12, 2021, witnesses reported a domestic disturbance involving the couple. A 911 caller claimed seeing a man slap a woman outside a grocery store. When officers located Gabby and Brian, the encounter was captured on body camera footage that would later be widely analyzed. Gabby appeared distressed. She was crying. Apologetic. At times, she blamed herself. Brian, by contrast, seemed composed, cooperative. He described escalating tension, saying Gabby had been anxious, struggling with obsessive tendencies. Officers noted visible marks, scratches on Brian's face and arms. The police classified the incident as a mental health crisis rather than domestic violence. No charges were filed. Instead, they separated the couple for the night, Brian in a hotel, Gabby alone in the van. It was a moment that, in hindsight, investigators and the public would revisit repeatedly, because within that footage, there were signals, subtle but present. Gabby's emotional state, the imbalance in how each of them spoke, the dynamic between explanation and apology. According to later expert commentary, these interactions may have suggested a pattern not fully recognized at the time. After Moab, the journey continued. They traveled north from Utah to Wyoming. The scenery became more expansive, peaceful, and remote. Gabby continued to post on social media from time to time, sharing photos and captions that suggested things were normal. However, she posted less often. Some would later say that her posts seemed different, less energetic, and more subdued. Then came the final confirmed sighting. On August 27th, witnesses at a restaurant in Jackson, Wyoming, reported an incident. According to their statements, Brian appeared agitated during an interaction with staff. Gabby was present. Tension was visible. The details varied, but the impression was consistent. Something was unraveling. After that, the trail began to fade. No verified public sightings of Gabby after August 27th. No confirmed communication that could be definitively attributed to her. Only fragments, texts, digital pings, the growing distance between what was shown online and what may have been happening off camera. The illusion of van life still lingered on the surface. But beneath it, investigators would soon discover, was a timeline marked not by freedom, but by isolation, conflict, and a narrowing set of possibilities. Somewhere along that route, something changed irrevocably. And whatever happened next would erase Gabby from that journey, leaving behind only clues, contradictions, and a story that was beginning to fracture under scrutiny. For Gabby's family, the silence was immediate and alarming. Nicole Schmidt and Joseph Petito began calling, texting, pleading for answers. They reached out not only to Brian, but also to his parents. There was no response. Messages went unanswered. According to public statements, the Petito family described the silence as unbearable, a void where even the smallest piece of information could have mattered. By early September, concern had turned into urgency. Gabby's regular communication had stopped completely. No calls. No social media updates. No confirmations of safety. Investigators would later identify this break as a critical deviation from her normal behavior pattern. On September 10th, Nicole Schmidt made a formal request for a check at the Laundrie residence. Police arrived, but Brian did not speak to them. His attorney advised him not to cooperate. Legally, he was within his rights. Investigatively, it created a wall. The next day, September 11th, Gabby Petito was officially reported missing. What followed was a rapid escalation. Northport police designated Brian Laundrie as a person of interest. Not a suspect, at least not yet, but central to the case. The timeline became the priority. Where had Gabby last been seen? When was her last confirmed communication? What had happened between August 27th and September 1st? Investigators began reconstructing her movements using phone records, witness statements, and digital data. Meanwhile, Brian remained at home. He did not speak publicly. He did not provide a statement. Each day of silence deepened suspicion, not as proof of guilt, but as an absence of explanation. In missing person cases, time is critical. Every hour without clarity reduces the chances of intervention. Then, another shift. On September 13th, Brian Laundrie left his home. According to his parents, he told them he was going to hike in the Carlton Reserve, a vast and heavily wooded area in Florida. He never returned. Now, there were two missing people. One, a young woman last seen in Wyoming. The other, the only known companion who could explain what happened, gone without a trace. The investigation, once focused on finding Gabby, was about to expand into something far more complex. Because the silence was no longer just about what Brian refused to say. It was about where he had gone, and what he might be trying to escape. The case did not remain quiet for long. By mid-September 2021, Gabby Petito's disappearance had moved beyond a missing person report. It had become a national story. Then, rapidly, a global one. Media coverage intensified. Major networks, CNN, NBC, ABC, began running continuous updates. Gabby's face appeared across screens, her name repeated in headlines. But it wasn't just traditional media driving the momentum. It was the public. Social media transformed the investigation. Thousands of users began analyzing every available detail: Instagram posts, YouTube footage, timestamps, geotags. What might have once taken investigators weeks to process was now being examined in real time by an entire digital audience. One video, in particular, shifted everything. On September 19th, a travel vlogger named Jen Bethune submitted footage to the FBI. She had been recording her own trip through Wyoming's Bridger Teton National Forest. While reviewing her video, she noticed something familiar: a white van, partially hidden along a dirt road. It matched Gabby and Brian's vehicle. The footage was dated August 27th, the same day as one of the last confirmed sightings of Gabby. Investigators quickly focused on the location, Spread Creek dispersed camping area. This was no longer abstract. It was a point on a map. At the same time, digital evidence continued to surface. Phone records indicated movement patterns. According to FBI findings, Brian Laundrie had used Gabby's debit card between August 30th and September 1st, making withdrawals totaling over $1,000. The transactions occurred after Gabby was last confirmed alive, raising immediate questions about consent and timeline. Meanwhile, text messages sent from Gabby's phone during that period were scrutinized. Investigators noted inconsistencies in tone and phrasing. Some messages, according to statements from her family, did not align with her usual communication style. Whether they were sent by Gabby herself or someone else remained under investigation. The timeline was tightening. August 27th, last confirmed sighting. August 30th, final text message. September 1st, Brian returns alone. Each date carried weight, each gap suggested something missing. Public attention also turned toward Brian Laundrie, who, by now, had disappeared. The manhunt intensified. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, expanded their search across Florida's Carlton Reserve. Drones, K-9 units, and ground teams combed through dense wetlands. Still, there was no trace. The case had split into two parallel investigations. Find Gabby. Find Brian. But in Wyoming, the first objective was about to reach a devastating conclusion. Because the location identified through a YouTube video, an ordinary recording by a passing traveler, had pointed investigators towards something far more final. And what they were about to discover would confirm what many had already feared. Gabby Petito was no longer missing. She was waiting to be found. On September 19, 2021, the search narrowed to a single area. Spread Creek, Bridger Teton National Forest. Wyoming. The location, identified through civilian footage and corroborated by investigative analysis, became the focal point of an intensive ground search. FBI agents and local authorities moved methodically through the terrain, open fields, patches of brush, the quiet vastness of wilderness that can both reveal and conceal. Then, within hours, they found her. Human remains were discovered near the campsite area. The announcement came later that day, during a brief but heavy press conference. Though formal identification would take time, investigators stated the remains were consistent with the description of Gabby Petito. 2 days later, on September 21st, the confirmation arrived. It was Gabby. The case, once a missing person investigation, was now officially a homicide. According to the Teton County coroner, Dr. Brent Blue, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The manner, homicide. Further forensic analysis would later estimate that Gabby had been dead for approximately 3 to 4 weeks before her body was found, placing her death sometime in late August. The timeline aligned. August 27th, the last confirmed sighting. Investigators began reconstructing her final moments through physical and digital evidence. The location itself told part of the story. The remote campsite. The isolation. No immediate witnesses. It was an environment where something could happen and remain unseen. But there were still questions. What exactly happened in those final hours? Details from the autopsy were not fully released to the public, but officials confirmed that the evidence pointed clearly toward intentional violence. This was not accidental. Not natural. It was deliberate. Attention turned, inevitably, back to Brian Laundrie. By this point, he was no longer just a person of interest in a missing person case. He was the only known individual who had been with Gabby in the days leading up to her death. And he was missing. The legal landscape shifted. On September 23rd, a federal arrest warrant was issued for Brian Laundrie for unauthorized use of a debit card. According to FBI records, he had used Gabby's financial accounts after her death. It was a tactical move, one that allowed law enforcement to pursue him actively while the homicide investigation continued to build. The search centered on Florida's Carlton Reserve, a vast, swampy wilderness spanning more than 24,000 acres. Dense vegetation. Flooded trails. Wildlife. It was terrain that resisted precision, swallowing footprints and distorting timelines. If someone intended to disappear, it was the kind of place that could make it possible. According to statements from Brian's parents, he had entered the reserve on September 13th. They claimed he went hiking. He took a backpack. He did not return. At first, investigators treated the information cautiously. But as days passed without any confirmed sightings, the reserve became ground zero for one of the most intensive manhunts in recent memory. Law enforcement deployed drones, cadaver dogs, amphibious vehicles, and search teams moving in grid patterns. Helicopters circled overhead. The FBI joined local agencies, coordinating efforts with increasing urgency. Still, nothing. No confirmed tracks. No verified encounters. No physical trace that could definitively place Brian within the reserve beyond the initial claim. Public scrutiny intensified. Questions began to surface about the timeline provided by Brian's parents. Why was he not reported missing immediately? Why did it take several days before authorities were notified? According to public statements, the Laundrie family initially told police he had left on September 14th, then later clarified the date as September 13th. That discrepancy, small on paper, became significant under investigation. Outside the Laundrie home, a crowd of protesters gathered with signs, while media vans filled the street. The case was no longer just a search, it represented something bigger, unanswered questions, and a race against time. Meanwhile, federal authorities expanded their focus. Brian Laundrie was now a fugitive. Investigators explored multiple theories. That he was hiding in the reserve. that he had left the area entirely, that he may have received assistance. None were confirmed. Each possibility stretched the search wider. Days turned into weeks. The Carlton Reserve flooded after heavy rains, complicating search efforts. Paths vanished underwater. Evidence, if it existed, became harder to recover. Still, teams continued, methodical, persistent, driven by the absence of answers. On October 20, 2021, more than a month after Brian Laundrie disappeared, the search in Carlton Reserve changed direction. The water had receded. Areas that were once submerged, impassable, were now accessible. Law enforcement returned to zones previously cleared but not fully examined. This time, Brian's parents accompanied them, guiding officers toward trails he was known to use. Investigators discovered personal items belonging to Brian Laundrie. A backpack, a notebook, and, nearby, partial human remains. The location was not deep within the reserve. It was relatively close to an entrance, an area that had been underwater during earlier searches. According to official statements, the remains were found in a place that had only recently become visible again. Dental records were used for identification. The confirmation followed shortly after. The remains were Brian Laundrie. Inside the recovered notebook, investigators found written statements. According to the FBI's later summary, Brian had claimed responsibility for Gabby Petito's death. He described an incident in which, allegedly, Gabby was injured during a fall near a creek. He wrote that he believed she was in severe pain, that she was suffering, and that he ended her life to stop her pain. It was a version of events presented without cross-examination, without challenge, without the scrutiny of a courtroom. And it raised immediate contradictions. The autopsy had determined Gabby died by strangulation, a method inconsistent with a spontaneous act of mercy. There was no public evidence confirming the type of injury Brian described. No indication that her death was accidental or medically necessitated. Investigators, while acknowledging the note, did not validate its claims as factual. Instead, they treated it as part of the evidentiary record, one perspective, unverified and untested. The timeline, however, became clearer. Late August, Gabby dies in Wyoming. August 30th to September 1st, Brian uses her financial accounts. September 1st, he returns to Florida. September 13th, he disappears into Carlton Reserve. Shortly afterwards, he passed away, believed to have taken his own life. The exact cause of Brian's death was later confirmed as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. There would be no trial, and no direct answers could be given under oath. There would be no cross-examination of the only person who had been there. There were only fragments of evidence and a written account that attempted to explain the events, but it could not be verified. For Gabby's family, the outcome brought a form of closure but not resolution. While the investigation had identified who was responsible, it could never fully reconstruct why. In cases like this, the absence of a living suspect leaves something unresolved. A silence remains that even evidence cannot completely fill. But the story did not end in a reserve, because what followed would move beyond the investigation and into the broader impact this case left behind, impacting laws, awareness, and how a single story can change the way thousands of others are seen. The case closed without a trial. No courtroom testimony. No cross-examination. No final verdict spoken aloud before a jury. Instead, the conclusion came through evidence, assembled piece by investigators, and a statement released by the FBI in January 2022. According to the agency's final report, the investigation determined that Brian Laundrie was responsible for Gabby Petito's death. The conclusion was based on a combination of forensic findings, digital evidence, witness accounts, and Brian's own written admission found in the notebook. Legally, the case reached its endpoint. But for Gabby's family, there were still gaps, moments that could never be fully reconstructed. Questions that no longer had a living person to answer them. In public statements, her family acknowledged the findings, while also emphasizing the emotional reality. Knowing what happened is not the same as understanding it. In the months that followed, the case shifted from investigation to impact. Gabby Petito's name became part of a broader national conversation, one that extended far beyond a single case. Advocacy groups, legal experts, and the public began examining the early warning signs that had been visible, yet not fully acted upon. The Moab police encounter, in particular, became a focal point. Body camera footage was reviewed by independent experts. Discussions emerged around how domestic incidents are assessed, how victims present under stress, and how law enforcement interprets visible versus psychological harm. The incident was later reclassified by some agencies as a domestic violence situation, prompting internal reviews of protocol and training. It raised difficult questions. How often are warning signs misunderstood? How many cases follow similar patterns, but never reach national attention? The disparity in media coverage also became part of the discussion. Commentators pointed to what is often referred to as missing white woman syndrome, the disproportionate attention given to certain cases over others. Gabby's story, while deeply impactful, highlighted broader systemic imbalances in which victims receive visibility, and which do not. Out of that awareness, action began to form. Gabby's family established the Gabby Petito Foundation, focusing on supporting families of missing persons and raising awareness around domestic violence. The foundation aimed to turn loss into prevention, to ensure that warning signs, once seen, are not dismissed. Civil proceedings followed as well. In 2022, Gabby's parents filed a lawsuit against Brian Laundrie's parents, alleging that they were aware of the situation and withheld information. According to court filings, the claims centered on emotional distress and the belief that earlier disclosure might have changed the outcome. The case was later resolved in February 2024, with a confidential settlement reached between the families. The case concluded quietly, without public admission or detailed explanation. Yet, its legacy persists. In law enforcement training, advocacy campaigns, the critical recognition of digital evidence in real-time investigations, and the awareness that curated images can mask a far more complex and dangerous reality. Gabby Petito's story, which began as a journey, ended as a landmark case. But what it left behind is something else entirely, a reminder that truth often emerges slowly, that silence can be as revealing as words, and that recognizing the early signs of danger may be the only chance to change an outcome before it's too late. The call came just after midnight. December 9, 2001. A man's voice, full of tension. He tells the dispatcher his wife has fallen down the stairs. She is still breathing, he says at first. Then, moments later, she is not. Police arrive at the Peterson residence on Cedar Street in Durham, North Carolina. What they encounter does not resemble a simple accident. Kathleen Peterson lies at the base of a narrow staircase. Her body is surrounded by blood, thick, dark, pooled across the hardwood floor and smeared along the walls. Blood spatter reaches higher than expected. Too high, according to later analysis, for a fall alone. The timeline is unclear from the start. Emergency responders note that Kathleen's blood appears partially dried. This suggests she may have been there longer than Michael initially indicated. According to the autopsy results, she had multiple lacerations on the back of her head, some estimated to be as many as 7, but no skull fracture, which is common in cases of fatal falls downstairs. Michael Peterson was standing nearby. He was barefoot and appeared calm, according to some officers who would later give statements. Others recalled something different. He appeared indifferent, almost as if he had been prepared for it. According to the initial report, he claims they had been outside by the pool earlier that evening. Kathleen had gone inside ahead of him. He says he found her after a few minutes, or maybe longer. There are no signs of forced entry. No immediate evidence of an intruder. The home is quiet, undisturbed. Investigators begin to consider the most immediate possibility: someone inside the house. Kathleen Peterson was a successful and well-respected executive at Nortel Networks. Those who knew her described her as driven, organized, pragmatic, and cautious. They believed she was not careless and would not have fallen without a clear reason. As the night goes on, the situation becomes more complicated. The amount of blood, the types of injuries, and the conflicting timelines don't add up. What first looked like a sad accident is slowly, but clearly, starting to seem like something suspicious. And at the center of it all stands Michael Peterson. Husband. Witness. Possibly more. By morning, the question is no longer just what happened on those stairs, but whether it was ever an accident at all. Before the blood, before the staircase, Michael Peterson was a man accustomed to narrative control. He was, by public record, a novelist, a columnist, a former Marine who had served in Vietnam, though aspects of his military record would later be disputed. In Durham, he was known as an outspoken political voice, sharp, articulate, and often critical of local authority. In 1999, he had even run for mayor. He lost, but not without drawing attention. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Peterson household appeared stable, affluent, blended. Michael and Kathleen had been married for over a decade. Together, they raised a complex family that included biological children and two daughters Michael had adopted after the death of a close family friend, Elizabeth Ratliff. Kathleen was the primary financial provider. Records later presented in court showed she earned a substantial income from her executive role at Nortel Networks. Michael, by contrast, had not published a novel in years. His income was limited, reportedly supplemented by Kathleen's success. On the surface, their marriage appeared functional, even affectionate. Friends described shared dinners, social gatherings, and a sense of partnership. But as investigators began to look closer, fractures started to emerge. According to emails recovered during the investigation, Michael had been engaging in secret online communications with male escorts. These exchanges, explicit in nature, were unknown to Kathleen, at least according to the prosecution's theory. There was no confirmed evidence that she had discovered them that night, but investigators began to consider whether a confrontation could have taken place. Financial records also painted a more complicated picture. Nortel, Kathleen's employer, was reportedly facing instability at the time. According to court testimony, her job security may have been uncertain. The Peterson household, despite its appearance, carried significant debt. The image of domestic harmony began to shift. Not collapse, but strain. Michael himself remained consistent in his account. He maintained that Kathleen's death was a tragic accident. That there had been no argument, no violence, no motive. Yet investigators could not ignore the contradictions forming around him. A man skilled in storytelling. A household under pressure. A private life concealed behind a carefully managed public image. And as detectives continued to reconstruct the final hours of Kathleen Peterson's life, one question began to take shape with increasing urgency. Was Michael Peterson simply a husband who found his wife too late, or a man who had already decided how the story would end? The staircase was central to the case. It was a narrow, wooden, winding staircase at the back of the house. It didn't seem like a place where someone would have a fatal fall. However, Michael Peterson claimed that Kathleen had slipped on these stairs, alone at night, and died from her injuries. Investigators returned to the scene with increasing scrutiny. What they saw did not settle into a simple narrative. Blood marked the walls in elongated streaks. There were patterns, fine droplets, and larger smears that extended upward, inconsistent, according to later expert testimony, with a single backward fall. Some analysts described the presence of what appeared to be cast-off patterns, often associated with repeated impacts. Others, including defense experts, would later argue that those patterns could result from coughing or exhalation during prolonged bleeding. The volume of blood was significant, more than what first responders expected from a fall. According to the autopsy results performed by the North Carolina medical examiner, Kathleen Peterson had multiple deep lacerations on her scalp, but no corresponding skull fracture. There were also injuries to her face and neck. Notably absent were defensive wounds on her hands or arms, though interpretations of this detail varied. The absence of a skull fracture became a point of contention. Prosecutors argued that the lacerations were consistent with blunt force trauma from an object. The defense countered that the injuries could occur if a person repeatedly struck their head against a hard surface during a fall. Time added another layer of uncertainty. Kathleen's blood had partially dried by the time emergency personnel arrived. According to investigative reports, this suggested a longer interval between injury and the 911 call than initially implied. Michael Peterson stated he had been outside by the pool for an extended period. The exact duration, however, remained unclear. Footprints in blood were documented at the scene. Some appeared to match Michael's shoes. Investigators questioned whether he had moved through the area after Kathleen was injured. He stated he had attempted to help her. No murder weapon was recovered. No clear sign of forced assault beyond the injuries themselves. And yet, the scene resisted simplicity. Experts began to divide. Some saw evidence of a violent encounter. Others saw a tragic, chaotic fall misinterpreted through expectation. The staircase, silent and unchanged, held both possibilities at once. As forensic experts disagreed, the investigation faced a crucial decision. If the crime scene couldn't provide clear answers, they would need to investigate the victim's history and background. The investigation did not remain confined to Durham. As detectives worked to understand Kathleen Peterson's death, a detail from Michael Peterson's past resurfaced, quietly at first, then with growing weight. It was not new. It had simply not been connected. In 1985, in Germany, a woman named Elizabeth Ratliff was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. She had been a close friend of Michael Peterson and his first wife. At the time, her death was ruled natural, attributed to a cerebral hemorrhage, according to German authorities. There was no suspicion of foul play. Michael Peterson was among the last people known to have seen her alive. After her death, Peterson and his wife became guardians to Ratliff's two daughters. They raised them as their own. For years, the event remained in the past, unquestioned, officially resolved. But in 2001, after Kathleen's death, investigators began to draw comparisons. Two women. Two staircases. Both are found at the bottom. Both with head injuries. Both are connected to Michael Peterson. The similarities were difficult to ignore. According to the investigation file, authorities in North Carolina sought to re-examine Ratliff's death. Her body was exhumed and transported to the United States for a second autopsy. The findings, presented by forensic pathologist Dr. Deborah Radish, differed sharply from the original German conclusion. She determined that Ratliff's injuries were consistent with homicide, specifically blunt force trauma. This conclusion was not universally accepted. Critics later argued that the re-evaluation, conducted years after death, may have been influenced by the circumstances surrounding Kathleen Peterson's case. The original ruling of natural causes remained part of the historical record. Still, for prosecutors, the pattern was compelling. They introduced Ratliff's death as evidence of what they described as a signature. Not proof of guilt on its own, but an indication of behavioral repetition. A prior incident, they argued, that mirrored the present case too closely to dismiss. For the defense, it was a dangerous leap. They maintained that the two deaths were unrelated. That coincidence, however unsettling, was not evidence of intent. But the narrative had shifted. The case was no longer just about a single night in Durham. It now carried the shadow of another death, another staircase, another unanswered question stretching back over a decade. And as the past weighed heavily on the present, investigators began to examine not only what had happened, but also the true character of Michael Peterson. As investigators pushed deeper, the case began to shift from the physical to the personal. What was once considered a stable, wealthy marriage now reveals layers of deception that have been subtly and deliberately concealed for years. The focus turned inward, toward Michael Peterson's private life. Toward what Kathleen may or may not have known. During the forensic examination of Michael's computer, investigators discovered a series of emails and digital files. According to court records, these communications included explicit exchanges with male escorts. The messages suggested ongoing contact, not isolated incidents. Some were recent, close enough in time to raise questions about whether they overlapped with the final days of Kathleen's life. There was no definitive evidence that Kathleen had discovered these communications. No recorded confrontation. No witness to an argument that night. But for prosecutors, the possibility became central. They constructed a theory that Kathleen, described by friends as pragmatic and disciplined, would not have accepted such a revelation easily. That if she had discovered Michael's secret, it could have triggered a confrontation. The defense countered with a different portrait. They argued that Michael's bisexuality was not a secret within the marriage. That Kathleen was aware, or at least not unaware. That their relationship, while unconventional, was built on mutual understanding. This claim, however, remained contested and not fully substantiated by independent evidence. Financial pressure added another dimension. According to trial testimony, the Peterson household carried significant debt despite its outward appearance of stability. Kathleen's income supported much of the family's lifestyle. At the same time, Nortel Networks was reportedly undergoing financial decline. Her position, once secure, may have been at risk, though the extent of that risk was not conclusively established. Prosecutors suggested a convergence of motives. Financial strain. Fear of exposure. The potential collapse of both personal and economic stability. No single factor stood alone. But together, they formed a framework. Even though motive suggests a reason, it doesn't prove guilt. It doesn't provide evidence like a weapon or recreate the crime. It simply offers a possible explanation for why the crime might have happened. And yet, as the prosecution continued to build its case, these hidden elements began to shape how the night on Cedar Street was understood. Not as an isolated event, but as the breaking point of something long concealed. The investigation was no longer searching only for physical evidence. It was searching for intent. And soon, that search would move into the courtroom, where every detail, every contradiction, every private truth would be laid bare under oath. The courtroom in Durham became the stage where two versions of the same night would collide, each built on the same evidence, yet leading to entirely different truths. Michael Peterson's trial began in 2003. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jim Hardin, presented a case grounded in violence. They argued that Kathleen Peterson did not fall, she was beaten. The injuries to her head, the volume of blood, and the patterns on the staircase walls pointed not to an accident, but to repeated blows from a weapon. There was no murder weapon recovered. Instead, prosecutors suggested an object consistent with a blow poke, a fireplace tool later found in the Peterson home. Though no definitive blood evidence tied it directly to the crime, they argued its shape and weight could explain the injuries. Central to the prosecution's case was blood-stained pattern analysis. Agent Dwayne Deaver of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation testified as an expert witness. He demonstrated how the blood patterns found on the walls in Michael Peterson's clothing were consistent, according to his analysis, with cast-off from a beating. He concluded that Michael was present during the infliction of the injuries. The defense challenged this immediately. They argued that Deaver's conclusions were flawed. The patterns could be explained by Kathleen's own movements, coughing, slipping, and attempting to stand as she bled. They brought forward their own experts, who disputed the interpretation of the blood evidence and emphasized the absence of skull fractures, which they argued would be expected in a sustained beating. Michael Peterson took the stand in his own defense. He spoke calmly, maintained his account. He described the evening by the pool, the moment he found Kathleen, his attempts to help her. He denied any argument, any violence, any involvement in her death. Under cross-examination, prosecutors focused on his credibility, his bisexual relationships, his financial situation. His past writings included fictional works that contained violent imagery. They suggested that beneath his composed exterior was a man capable of constructing a narrative and living inside it. The defense pushed back, framing the case as a tragic accident distorted by assumption. They argued that the prosecution had built its theory on interpretation rather than certainty. There was no direct evidence, no eyewitness, no weapon, no confession, placing Michael Peterson as a killer. After weeks of testimony, the jury faced conflicting expert opinions and debated evidence. Two different narratives emerged surrounding one staircase and one death. The central, unresolved question was this a murder disguised as an accident, or a genuine tragedy misinterpreted due to suspicion? The verdict, when it came in October 2003, appeared to bring finality. Michael Peterson was found guilty of the murder of Kathleen Peterson. The jury, after deliberation, accepted the prosecution's narrative that the death on the staircase was not an accident but an act of violence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For years, the case seemed settled. But beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift. Dwayne Deaver, an analyst at the State Bureau of Investigation, was central to this change. His testimony, especially his bloodstain analysis, was key in convicting Michael Peterson. Deaver's analysis heavily influenced the jury's understanding of the crime scene and directly connected Peterson to the alleged attack. Then, years later, those conclusions began to unravel. According to internal investigations conducted by the North Carolina SBI, Deaver's work in multiple cases, not just Peterson's, was found to be deeply flawed. Reports indicated that he had overstated findings, misrepresented results, and, in some instances, provided testimony that exceeded what the evidence could scientifically support. In 2011, Deaver was dismissed from the SBI. The implications were immediate and profound. Defense attorneys filed motions arguing that Peterson's conviction had been tainted by unreliable forensic testimony. According to court filings, Deaver's analysis had not only influenced the jury, it had framed the entire narrative of the prosecution's case. A judge agreed to re-examine the matter. In December 2011, after extensive hearings, Superior Court Judge Orlando Hudson ruled that Michael Peterson was entitled to a new trial. The decision was based on the conclusion that Deaver's testimony had been materially misleading and that the jury had been presented with evidence that could not be considered scientifically sound. After 8 years in prison, Michael Peterson was released on bail. The case, once thought resolved, was reopened. But the passage of time had changed everything. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Evidence, once fresh, now carried the weight of reinterpretation. The certainty that had once defined the verdict began to dissolve into doubt. The justice system, meant to provide clear answers, was now being questioned. How much of the initial conviction was based on shaky evidence? And if the basis of the conviction was wrong, what could still be considered reliable? The case was no longer simply about the events on the staircase. It had evolved into a challenge to the integrity of the justice system. The conclusion wouldn't offer definitive proof, but rather a negotiated agreement. By 2017, the case had stretched across 16 years. What began as a late-night emergency call had evolved into one of the most debated criminal cases in modern American legal history. A conviction had been secured, then weakened, then undone. What remained was not resolution, but exhaustion. The prosecution faced a decision. Retrying the case would mean reconstructing a narrative from aging evidence and witnesses whose memories had inevitably eroded. The defense, meanwhile, stood firm in its position that Michael Peterson had never committed a crime, that Kathleen's death was a tragic accident misinterpreted through flawed forensic analysis. Neither side held absolute certainty anymore. In February 2017, Michael Peterson entered what is legally known as an Alford plea. He formally pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, but crucially, he did not admit to committing the crime. Instead, he acknowledged that the prosecution possessed enough evidence that a jury could likely convict him again. The court accepted the plea. He was sentenced to the time already served. Michael Peterson walked free. Legally, the case reached its conclusion. But factually, it remained unresolved. There was no definitive reconstruction of Kathleen Peterson's final moments that satisfied all the evidence. The prosecution's theory of homicide had been weakened by discredited forensic testimony. The defense's theory of accidental fall, while plausible to some experts, did not fully explain every injury, every blood pattern, every inconsistency in timing. Alternative theories emerged over time, including one involving a possible owl attack outside the home, suggested by defense consultants years later. This theory, while supported by certain physical details such as microscopic feathers found at the scene, was never tested in court and remains unproven. In the absence of certainty, the case settled into ambiguity. Kathleen Peterson's family was left with a loss that no verdict could fully address. Some members continued to believe in Michael's guilt. Others expressed doubt. The division itself became part of the aftermath. For the legal system, the case raised enduring questions about the reliability of forensic science, the influence of expert testimony, and the fragile boundary between interpretation and fact. The Cedar Street staircase remains a source of unresolved tension for those who examine the case. Two possibilities linger: a violent act or an accident. Neither has been definitively proven or disproven. The case provides no resolution, only a persistent question: how close can justice get to the truth when the truth itself remains elusive?